Deus Ex is one of the most important series of all time, not just from a mechanical perspective, but from a narrative one as well. Its gameplay would make it one of the early pioneers of the immersive sim, a genre of games bent on giving the player multiple routes and options to tackle any given situation, allowing them to play how they want without ever feeling like their style is invalid. From a story perspective, however, it's a game whose narrative has only gotten more relevant with time. From government cover-ups and corrupt officials to discrimination and bigotry, Deus Ex explores all these topics with impressive form, and it's this part that I want to focus on today. I want to take you through the story of Deus Ex and both critique, analyze, and discuss it along the way. It's a series of many highs and lows, sometimes even in the same game. But at its core, Deus Ex has a lot to say about the world, and I have a lot to say about it. So without further ado, like the video if you enjoy, and subscribe for more content like this. Feel free to watch my other videos which are similar in style to this one, but on a variety of games and series. And as always, let's get started. The original Deus Ex first began development in 1997 and was built on a dream. Warren Spector, the director behind the game, wanted to make a very particular game, one where choice was king, one where the player could play how they wanted and still reach the end. It would be what he called a real-world role-playing game. Unfortunately, the tech wasn't there in the early to mid-90s, so we worked on an impressive catalog of other titles like Ultima Underworld, Thief, and System Shock, hoping that one day he could see his dream game through. Frustrated with his employment at Looking Glass, he sought employment elsewhere at Electronic Arts, until of all people, John Romero, the OG of the FPS genre, offered him a spot at his company Ion Storm, stating that he'd be able to make his dream game without any restrictions. That game was Deus Ex. The inspiration for Deus Ex came from all places Warren's wife, who was fascinated by the X-Files. Growing tired of the typical fantasy settings, he wanted to create something that would blend his love of player choice with a realistic setting. What set Deus Ex further apart from its other contemporaries was its focus on conspiracies. Spector wanted to take popular conspiracies from around the world and not only make them true, but spin them in a way that made sense. One such example is the Illuminati. To many, there is a conspiracy that there is a shadow organization that are the true rulers of the world, due to them controlling the governments of the world through literal power or blackmail. Deus Ex takes this and makes it true, as the Illuminati not only exists within the game world, but we also get to meet various members of the team and even work together to defeat Majestic 12. They too are also filled with their own kind of conspiracy, as Majestic 12, often shortened to MJ-12, is believed to be a group of people who were involved in the cleanup and recovery of alien spacecraft. It started in the 1980s when British ufologist, a title I just learned existed, named Timothy Good, claimed to be in possession of 1950s-era UFO documents. In them were the names of 12 individuals ranging from military officers to government officials and secret scientists, all who helped recover UFOs across the US, thus the Majestic 12. It picked up a lot of steam during the same time when the famous Roswell UFO incident was re-examined, as many people believed that it wasn't a military balloon that crashed like the government said, but rather an extraterrestrial aircraft. Deus Ex doesn't go as deep on the UFO side as the real Majestic 12, but that's due to them being wrapped up in the game's own conspiracy. Still, you could see how this is different when compared to other games of the time, not just ones in the immersive sim genre. And I think that's a large reason for the game's success. It was not only a completely original idea for the early 2000s, but it also preyed on people's love for a good conspiracy. While its focus is mainly on conspiracies, it's also a game about corporate corruption and greed, all put together in a multi-layered story filled with unreliable narrators and fake news. Kojima rightfully gets credit for creating Metal Gear Solid 2, a game that is more relevant now than it was when it first released. But I don't see nearly enough praise for Warren Spector doing the same thing just a year before Sons of Liberty. All of this when put together makes for a rather compelling narrative. In fact, it reminds me a lot of the 1999 film The Matrix. As in that movie, one of the characters, Morpheus, talks to the main protagonist, Neo, about taking two different colored pills. The catch is that one pill will send him back to reality like nothing happened, with the other allowing him to go further down the rabbit hole. This scene is a perfect representation of Deus Ex and is the best way to convey what the games are about without actually talking about its events. Deus Ex is in a way its own kind of conspiracy, as the further you go, the weirder it gets. It starts off quite tame, where we work as an agent fighting against terrorists, only for it to come crumbling down in just a few short missions, as we find out that the group we work for is not only lying to us, but is getting their own strings pulled from the shadows by a group of people who want to rule the world. It's a rabbit hole that gets increasingly more bizarre the further you go, but there is a sense that there is an ending to all this, and that once you come out the other side, you'll have discovered the real story. All that is required of the player is to take the first step and fall into the deep chasm that is this game's story. So, let's do it. The game's whole plot starts with a real sucker punch to audiences nowadays by stating that the world is being ravaged by a worldwide plague called the Grey Death, with a vaccine called Ambrosia being distributed to help quell the effects of the plague. Just like our own virus, the people of the world also needed frequent doses, in this case monthly injections, or they'll end up contracting it. This poses a large problem for the UN and the governments of the world, as not only do they need to make enough for everyone, but they need to keep making more if the human race has any chance of surviving this pandemic. Naturally, there isn't enough to go around, but many middle and lower class people are starting riots and fights over this stuff, not just because the world has turned into a sort of dog-eat-dog world, but many also believe that not only is the government hoarding vials of ambrosia for themselves, but that they were the ones who made the virus in the first place. Talk about an accusation. For as much as I will praise the writing and premise of this game though, its one fault is lack of subtlety. The opening crawl shows two people named Bob Page and Walter Simons, who are without question the most villainous people possible. Both of them are pleased to hear that a US senator was infected with this virus, and when asked if he accepted the vaccine, Bob Page claimed that it was almost pathetic how quickly he wanted to be cured. Following this, Walter informs Page that riots are breaking out across the city over the poor distribution of the vaccine, to which he says,
"Why contain it? Let it spill over into the schools and churches. Let the bodies pile up in the streets. In the end, they'll beg us to save them."
While Walter is not as obvious about his intentions, he is complacent in Bob Page's comments, implying that he agrees with him. Majestic 12, the group that Bob Page is a part of, and the one that Walter is allied with, also has a logo of a hand over the earth, basically implying that they want the world in the palm of their hand. I cannot imagine that anyone was meant to assume they have any kind of nuance to them, as they make it clear within the first cutscene of the game before the player even gets a chance to shoot at somebody that they're the bad guys. I'm unsure whether I should condemn this choice or praise it though, as while the characters themselves are as black and white as you can get, their actions and motivations are where that gray area comes from. Why they're doing this, how they want to go about enacting this plan, and the methods the other guys use to stop them create enough nuance to where it's better to just not trust anyone at all. It's a peculiar style of storytelling, one that had me confused for a time as the game had set itself up to be about conspiracy and how not everything is as it says it was. Yet right in its opening moments it throws up a big neon sign that says, "We're the bad guys." Although in all fairness, mixing enough black and white together will create shades of gray. Following that scene, the player can start playing. We play as JC Denton, a nano-augmented soldier who just joined UNATCO, a coalition of people who were hired to fight back against international terrorism. They were originally conceived of thanks to an attack on Liberty Island. Due to this, the group also set up its main headquarters on that island, right near the coast. The reason we're here is because the terrorists called the NSF have attacked one of the government ships of Ambrosia. So we're going to infiltrate the base, question the leader, and find the missing shipment. Deus Ex wastes no time not only getting the player into the action, but also letting them experience it for themselves. The whole island has essentially become a playground for the player to experiment with, which is where that play how you want model that Warren Spector envisioned comes in. While I won't spend too much time talking about the gameplay systems and various changes made to the gameplay within the series, it's worth at least explaining what the genre is and how that impacts the story. Deus Ex is considered an immersive sim, which might be one of the hardest genres to actually define, as what sets that genre apart from the rest is not something mechanical like a point of view, but rather a variety of complex systems that other games use, but these in particular use more. Spector wrote a manifesto of sorts on Deus Ex, and I think this one part where he describes the game's principles is a wonderful summarization of the whole genre. He says, "Problems, not puzzles, no forced failure, players do, NPCs watch, and areas with multiple entries and exit points." While a great statement, it could still be confusing to understand, so I often just mention the games that are considered immersive sims rather than explain what they do. The popular of the bunch include System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, Prey 2017, Dishonored, and quite a few more. These principles though allow the gameplay to not only flourish on its own, but also uplift the story along the way. Giving the player the freedom to choose how they want lets them essentially create their own story. Take Mission 2 for example in Hell's Kitchen. In a back alley there's a woman named Sandra who's being cornered by a man named Johnny. If you decide to intervene, she will thank you and give you a passcode that opens the door to Smuggler, an arms dealer. He has his own string of interactions where he could save his buddy Ford to get a discount on some of his items, which then turns into an investigation as to why there's a base of soldiers underneath the streets of New York City who also claim to know JC. Sandra, on the other hand, will then get into a fight with her father in a later mission over a guy named Jojo Fine. The next in line for the Joestar family, presumably, Jojo has had quite the bizarre adventure by being the city's pimp, and one of his girls is Sandra. Her dad wants to confront him, but doing so has the two get into a shootout. He isn't packing any heat though, and will die if we don't arm him ourselves. Depending on what occurs here, Sandra will either stay with her dad at the hotel or skip town, only to be found homeless at a gas station thanks to her getting robbed at gunpoint. All of this starts with you deciding whether or not to help her in this moment. What's even more impressive is that this idea is carried throughout the whole game in much smaller and more immediate ways, like alternate routes and boss fights. Talking to this kid and giving him food will provide JC with a code that lets him enter an NSF base through the back. And the bosses, some of which are our allies, can also be killed in multiple ways and at different times. Agent Anna Navarre, for example, can be killed here in Mission 3, which as a reward will give the player information on JC's birth and his purpose within UNATCO. Refusing to kill her here gives you the option to kill her in Mission 4, but that's a pretty difficult mission on its own as you have to survive a section that is intended for you to die. Her last location is in Mission 5, which has its own unique method of delivering death, as you could search the computers of UNATCO to find her kill phrase, which when spoken, kills her, skipping the fight entirely. However, Anna is unfortunately the exception and not the rule here, as the other bosses, Walter and Gunther, don't have nearly as many options. Walter especially, as he doesn't have a kill phrase of his own. Still, the sheer level of depth and complexity just within one of these decisions is more than some whole games have, which is why Deus Ex is one of the finest immersive sims of all time, and not just in how it creates its gameplay, but also in how that feeling of complete freedom extends to the story, letting you shape the world as you see fit. Returning to the story, regardless of how you navigate the island, you'll eventually come across the leader of this terrorist unit. This is where the game starts its descent into madness, as the leader says that they took the ambrosia not for themselves but for the people, further stating that the government made the plague to control the population. He then goes on a tangent and has some takes that some may consider quite based.
You have a single fact to back that up?
Number 1. In 1945, corporations paid 50% of federal taxes. Now they pay about 5%. Number 2. In 1900, 90% of Americans were self-employed. Now it's about 2%.
So?
It's called consolidation. Strengthen governments and corporations, weaken individuals. With taxes, this can be done imperceptibly over time. The entire executive branch is handpicked. 19 of the last 23 U.S. presidents have been members of the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission is financed by the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Don't tell me.
That's a think tank. Anyone can become a member.
But not everyone does. That's why they call it the secret government.
At the time, the guy can be seen as a nutcase and nothing more, but it is peculiar why he decided to say that to you. He has no reason to explain himself, but it gives off the impression that he wants you to know. It's the devs at Ion Storm trying to get you to question what's around you under the guise of normal conversation. Within the conversation is a talk about the ambrosia and where that shipment went, which is where the next mission takes us. I must say though, nothing gets the few neurons left in my brain to fizzle together than some clever wordplay. Ambrosia is the name of the vaccine, which is a word with origins from Greek mythology, used as the name for a specific food or drink that gives longevity or immortality to those that consume it, and I think a vaccine being named as such is quite fitting. The game also does this with its 4 AI, Daedalus, Icarus, Helios, and Morpheus. Like Ambrosia, they all come from Greek mythology. Daedalus and Icarus were father and son respectively, which connects the fact that Daedalus is the older AI with Icarus being the newer one. They will eventually come together and merge into another AI called Helios, who is the personification of the sun, something that is uniquely tied to Daedalus and Icarus, as it's well known in the myth that Icarus flew too close to the sun and burned up. This is also not the only time the series will use this specific character, as the reboot game's protagonist Adam Jensen is seen as Icarus in one of the game's scenes. Morpheus, on the other hand, was made to repeat people's life stories thanks to being created by the Illuminati, who without a shadow of a doubt have lots of people's data and information. Morpheus in the myth is the god of dreams and appears in people's dreams for various reasons. The connection is that they both know a lot about people without their knowledge. To add to this, the game's name is a clever wordplay in itself. The original title was either going to be Shooter or Troubleshooter, which was supposed to be ironic as the game was not a shooter. Even though it was eventually changed to Deus Ex, which is a much better title might I add, Deus Ex is an abbreviation of Deus Ex Machina, a story trope where a seemingly unsolvable problem is resolved by an unlikely scenario. While not explicitly stated, it's possible that this Deus Ex Machina was meant to be about the player. Video games are fiction, just pretend. The best games remove the disconnect as much as possible by attempting to immerse the player in the game world, but all games are fictional, regardless of how good they are at hiding it. In most stories, we as the protagonist are also the ones to do the impossible, and through not just the narrative structure but also outside elements like wiki guides and safe scumming, the player can get exactly what they want. One that always stuck with me was the suicide mission of Mass Effect 2. A complicated final mission that could see some of your crew you've come to know and love die due to your negligence. Some people, and I'm guilty of this too, cannot stomach the fact that they pissed off or killed a character they like, so rather than taking it on the chin and moving on, they'll reload a save and do it again. Deus Ex is like all of these games, with the player being the Deus Ex Machina. It's just more self-aware about it. JC, while an important character, is really just a small cog in a much larger mechanism, but over the course of the game, he'll be able to stop the machine entirely. He is the cause of the people's fates in the side quests, like Smuggler, Ford, and Sandra, and he is the force that propels the narrative forward. As a first mission though, Deus Ex is off to a great start mechanically. Lots of its story and gameplay choices won't start to show their hand for a little while longer, but since this is little more than a glorified tutorial, I think it gives the player a good indication of how the game is played. The first bunch of missions, or what I call Act 1, is where things are tame. We're just regular old J.C. Denton, playing the role of a UNATCO agent, nothing out of the ordinary. It's not until the end of Mission 3 where the story starts to change, but throughout these levels are datapads and newspapers that give the player a look outside the world of these levels, and it's clear to tell that it's always been quite the shit show. There was a recent outbreak in Brooklyn, but the National Guard had failed to contain the virus and save those affected by it. Furthermore, the US Supreme Court had passed a law a few years ago called grid zoning, which walls off Manhattan and its other boroughs due to a bombing that occurred there. The issue is that these places are completely walled off and foot traffic between places is prohibited. They've essentially sectioned off parts of New York from everyone else. One Supreme Court justice backed up his argument by saying that the freedom of the American individual must be balanced against the needs of a community to feel safe and secure. Many have opposed this law though and claim that it is the legalization of social oppression. In a more satirical twist, we have another news report about current President Meade, who's being criticized by Congress for, get this, paying the money they owe to the United Nations. The cabinet has routinely refused to pay what it owes and is disappointed at President Meade for doing such a thing. One such congressman says, quote, "No sir, a superpower does not pay rent." In response, it seems like members of Congress have started creating smear campaigns against him. As one person claimed that the crater on Mars resembled the face of President Meade, proving that he is an extraterrestrial alien. This also connects to another ongoing theory that the Grey Death is a virus created by a group of aliens who want to conquer us, implying that President Meade is one of these aliens. Realistically, anyone with a brain would see how stupid this is, but it's meant as an element of satire by showing the dumbest possible example of a kind of thing that already exists in our world today. Former President Barack Obama came under fire after being elected because someone claimed that he wasn't a natural-born US citizen. To be president in the US, you must be born in the United States, live here for at least 14 years, and be older than 35. Many people, due to his policies, although more likely for racist reasons, thought that Barack Obama was not eligible to be president, claiming that he was born in Kenya. This led to him showing the American people his birth certificate, but even when faced with the facts, people continue to deny it. People do not like to admit that they're wrong. As humans, we like to win and to be correct, so being wrong is the same as losing or admitting defeat, but the most capable of people can learn from those failures and apply that to their future endeavors. For most people, falling to misinformation results in them doubling down on their claim or just shutting their ears to the conversation entirely. That's why conspiracy theories such as these can have drastic consequences for them. Most people likely believe that Obama was born in Hawaii, just as the certificate said, but there are still quite a few people out there who can't accept that they might be wrong, so they continue to push the idea whenever they can. Misinformation can be harmful, not just because of what it can do to a person's life, but also by way of distracting people from the topic at hand. President Meade might actually be a bad president, but diverting the conversation away from his actual policies to focus on some bogus claim that he is an alien is absurd. Yet it probably worked, because people who hate him don't care about the facts and will use that info as ammo even if it's a complete dud. This newspaper was also what prompted me to mention that comment about Kojima and MGS2. I wouldn't say neither Spectre nor Kojima predicted the future, as these issues they tackle were relevant or at least showing their faces back then too, but it is still quite impressive that a piece of media from over 2 decades ago could still be brought up in conversation today. Deus Ex for the most part is a drastic look at our world. Yeah, we don't have people claiming that presidents are aliens, but the core concept of smear campaigns and illegitimate claims are still something that happens today because people can't get along. Another group of people who apparently can't get along is Paul and UNATCO, as Mission 3 has us sneaking into an NSF-controlled military base to find the ambrosia we're trying to secure in the first mission, before running into our brother Paul right in the core of the base. He immediately admits that he's been working with NSF the whole time and that UNATCO is the enemy and not them. While he doesn't show up much in the game and could die due to your actions in a future mission, thus making his screen time even less, which is something I'm not a huge fan of, it was smart to make Paul the one to relay this info to JC. This conversation is similar to the one we had with the terrorist leader from the first mission, but given the context of that mission and the fact that it was only 30 minutes into the game, you'd be forgiven for thinking he was nothing more than a mindless quack. But Paul is different. He's the brother of JC. He has no reason to lie to you, so even though you might not agree with what he has to say, it's at least worth hearing him out. According to him, the virus is indeed man-made, and the UN cannot be trusted. He urges us to talk to the leader Lebedev if we want to know more. He doesn't say much originally because we're interrupted by Anna, but given that Paul betrayed UNATCO and joined him, letting him speak would be able to give us a better understanding of what's going on here. Assuming you do, he elaborates on his prior claims and states that both Paul and JC were experimental humans made by Majestic 12. MJ-12 wanted to have their own super soldier as a sort of ace in the hole, and Paul was originally designed to be that soldier until they started becoming displeased with his actions and then decided to take JC out of the tank. The key difference between the brothers is that JC was raised without his parents' involvement. JC's whole life was meant to be a soldier who has unwavering loyalty to UNATCO and MJ-12. The concept of free will and the ability to make our own choices, even if they're bad ones, is the one thing that defines a human being. Taking that away from someone makes them less like a human and more like a pawn, and this is further exacerbated by what follows. As JC reports back to UNATCO for a briefing, only to hear that they've activated Paul's kill switch. Paul was nothing more than a tool for this group to use to their liking, and once he was no longer useful, they tossed him in the trash. Fortunately, we will find out that Paul is still alive, but it creates this odd feeling of discomfort in the player and JC. That just like Paul, they are tools, nothing more. JC's newest mission is to find Tracer Tong, a contact of Paul's in Hong Kong, and kill him. We aren't going to do that though, and instead visit Paul at his apartment in Hell's Kitchen to see how he's doing. This is where the next layer of the rabbit hole starts to form, as Paul wants us to relay a signal to his NSF allies. But upon doing that, Walter immediately instructs all UNATCO troopers to attack us. From here on out, UNATCO and some of the local police will be on our ass, shooting us without question. Manderley is the leader of UNATCO, but he's more of a pretty face for the company, as Walter takes over shortly after and starts using the power of FEMA to enact martial law. UNATCO will soon flood the streets of Hell's Kitchen and issue a curfew at nights that no one can go out. He will also shut down some New York canals and shipyards so that he can escort a freighter carrying tons of the Grey Death virus to the ports without being caught. It's clear that his power knows no bounds, and is someone who is without question a threat to the world. However, through Walter, Deus Ex keeps continuity with an ongoing conspiracy related to FEMA. FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is a group of people who help out during natural disasters. If something like a hurricane were to hit a state or country, FEMA would usually be the first ones to arrive and offer aid and assistance. Some people believe that FEMA uses these opportunities to get rid of individuals targeted by the New World Order under the guise that they're enacting martial law. In all fairness, the claims do have some weight to them, as a real program called Rex 84 does just that. Its instructions detailed how the US government would be able to detain residents it deems as national security threats if the president declares a national emergency. These people would then be detained at concentration camps operated and run by FEMA. Now, while that may not sound bizarre, as people who are national threats to the country should be detained, consider the fact that following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, tens of thousands of Japanese American citizens were removed from their homes and forced to live in camps during World War II, simply because the government thought that anyone who was Japanese could be a threat to the US. Relating this to Deus Ex, Rex 84, called RX 84 in-game, was a directive that Walter and Bob Page did end up enacting towards the later half of the game. Except it ended up failing due to multiple governments and military officials refusing to comply with Walter and FEMA's orders. Still, the fact that they even have this power to begin with is terrifying, and shows that FEMA and Majestic 12 will stop at nothing until the world is eating out of the palm of their hands. The only person who becomes quite the thorn in their side and has the chance to disrupt this operation is JC, which is why Walter sends UNATCO troops after him. This upcoming section is where the intended death sequence comes in, as you're meant to die either here or make it to the subway only for you to be stopped by Gunther, who will arrest you on sight. This then places you in a jail cell deep in a Majestic 12 lab, several floors below our place of employment, further confirming that MJ-12 is always just a few meters away from us. Helping us escape though is Daedalus, an AI who used to be allied with MJ-12 but is now working for JC after learning of his defection from UNATCO. While Daedalus can help JC escape, he has another problem. Walter activated his kill switch and now he has 23 hours left until it goes off, shutting off his augmentations and killing him for good. To solve this conundrum, we have to go to Hong Kong and meet with Tracer Tong, the one who worked for Paul, to see if we can get this removed. Hong Kong is a gorgeous place, as the market is packed to the brim with people and stalls of all kinds. We also haven't talked about this much, but the music throughout this game is fantastic. I tend to use the OSTs of the games I'm talking about to keep things consistent, and most games have anywhere between 60 to 90 minutes of music to listen to. Deus Ex has a whopping 5 hours of different soundtracks, because there is a different ambience, conversation, battle, and death track for every level, and this goes for any time there is a new location too. Right before Hong Kong, we're stopped at a helipad and need to unlock the restrictions put on the helicopter so that we can escape. This is like a 10-minute section at most that you will only ever visit one time, yet it has a unique track specific to this location. The rest of the soundtrack though does continue to go the extra mile in uplifting the life of its respective levels, some of which you may have already heard throughout the video, like the corporate and peaceful tune of UNATCO, or the lonely but surprisingly comforting feeling of exploring the DuClaire Chateau. All of it is fantastic and is without a doubt the best collection of music in the entire series. Just because we're in a different country though doesn't mean our continued themes of corruption and conspiracy are suddenly going to disappear. Hong Kong has been in the midst of a war between the Red Arrow and the Luminous Path Triad gangs, and at the heart of this conflict is a Blue Dragon sword. The Dragon sword was made by Majestic 12 in one of their experiments, but the leader of the Red Arrow stole the original prototype. This would have given the gang more power over Luminous Path, so a woman named Maggie Chow killed the Red Arrow leader, blamed it on the Luminous Path, so the two would start a clan war. Maggie Chow also happens to work for Majestic 12, so this whole plan was made as an act by Majestic 12 to keep its power over Hong Kong. So to stop the fighting, we're going to get the sword back, make a few copies, and then give them to each of the Tri gangs so they could stop fighting. As corny of a plot as this sounds, seeing as this could very easily serve as the main plot for a Rush Hour sequel, the reason we're doing this is because the Luminous Path is holding Tracer Tong in their base, so we scratch their back and they scratch ours. Getting the groups to consider a truce is all we have to do to enter, but actually getting them to follow through on that truce is what will happen next. The end of this questline has us visiting the labs of VersaLife, a business owned by Majestic 12. Once we make it down here, Daedalus instructs us how to destroy the group's Universal Conductor, which is the device the group used to manufacture the Grey Death. Tracer Tong then points out that from the information we gathered, they're planning on shipping some more Grey Death to New York via a freighter, but that freighter used to be owned by Stanton Dowd, a member of the Illuminati. Like all good stories, a steady growth of escalation is necessary to make the story flow well, and since Deus Ex is a game about conspiracy theories, it's only natural that the apex of the game's escalation is a meeting with the most popular conspiracy theory to date. The final act of the game is where things really start to go back to its older roots, as most of these missions are like the first mission, infiltrating a large base for the entirety of the runtime. First, we start with the aforementioned freighter, then we have to move through the streets of Paris, and even take a quick trip through the long, confusing halls of the country's catacombs. Along the way, we start to learn a bit more about Bob Page, as he seems to be the head of Majestic 12, but anything we know about him is just anything the public knows. Well, Bob Page used to be a part of the Illuminati, but eventually broke off to form Majestic 12. Around 2030, a couple decades before the game took place, the US government was about to collapse. Rather than help them, the Illuminati opted to watch them crumble so they could then take the position of power for themselves. However, the US did not collapse, which caused problems for the organization. Annoyed by its current direction, Bob Page then worked with Majestic 12, who at the time was just a small subsection of the Illuminati, to overthrow them, which is why the Illuminati was forced to go into hiding, and why Bob Page has more power under Majestic 12. So instead of enemies to lovers, we have lovers to enemies. What's even worse is that Bob Page also created what's called the Aquinas Protocol, a project that was basically going to be a better internet. But in reality, it was a tool used by Majestic 12 to have complete control over the internet. This is of course on top of the fact that he is currently manufacturing a widespread plague to control and manipulate the population. Fortunately, we do have a way to stop him, but that requires us to meet another member of the Illuminati. Morgan Everett is his name, who instructs us to go to a place in Vanderburg, as the lab there also has a universal conductor that we can use to synthesize a cure for the virus. All of this culminates in the final peak of the story, and just like the Illuminati, a game about conspiracies would not be complete if we didn't take a trip to Area 51. While exploring its dark hallways, you'll be met with a call by your allies, who all want you to enact their plan for the base, which in turn provides an ending to the game. Tracer Tong wants us to destroy Area 51. Doing so would kill Bob Page along with the Aquinas Protocol, which Tracer Tong finds to be too dangerous for anyone to own. The drawback is that destroying this would send the world into a dark age, as it's essentially like removing the internet for good. All forms of entertainment and communication would be gone, and companies would not only have slower production rates, but people who rely on technology for their jobs would be screwed. It's an awful outcome, but one that he considers to be a necessary evil. Morgan Everett, on the other hand, wants to keep the base, and he believes that we could use the Aquinas Protocol and Helios to our advantage, as he also extends JC an invitation to join the Illuminati. While the world in theory would go back to normal and not have the doomsday clock ringing anymore, it would be once again ruled by a shadow organization whose first and foremost goal is to make sure they remain on top. Yeah, they might be a benefit to society, something we will see in the sequel's endings, but if something gets in their way or threatens their rule, consider that a thing of the past, which is both harmful and restricts the personal freedoms the people of the world should have. Continuing the theme of personal freedom, Helios wants to merge with JC to create the perfect ruler. Helios believes themselves to be the perfect ruler because they are a machine, and thus lack the human desire of ambition. Helios does not seek power to get something out of it like the previous two. He has no way to feel ambition, so he rules because he can. It also believes that the checks and balances system democratic societies often create aren't capable anymore, as human beings aren't able to govern people. Checks and balances keeps the branches of the governments in check, so that no branch is stronger or better than the other. So the government branches govern themselves because everyone needs to be kept in check with each other. Helios thinks that this is because people who run branches are humans and not a machine like them. This, however, would turn the world into a dictatorship, and can an AI be trusted to do that even with JC involved in the process? Helios was designed to further humanity, but what differentiates between enhancing and not enhancing humanity? Would it take unnecessary or hostile steps in order to achieve this goal, like killing certain people under the guise that it's for the greater good? While all of these endings are great, realistically, are any of these endings good, morally speaking? Not at all. And this might be one of my favorite moments in the game, as it acts as a sort of unveiling of the cloth to show that this was all just a simulation, and that we, like JC, are only as powerful as the script wants us to be. JC is the Deus Ex Machina that can solve the unsolvable, so by that metric, the player too is the Deus Ex Machina, but we can only solve the unsolvable thanks to the devs allowing us to do so. In the same way UNATCO is having its strings pulled by Majestic 12, the player's having its strings pulled by the devs, letting them play hero for as long as they want before revealing that they won't get the ending they wanted. There is no golden goose of an ending here, something has to give. We can beat anything the game throws at us, except fate itself, and that fate is about to be decided right now. While I enjoy the moral complexities of each ending, the main issue with them is that they're all surface level looks at what occurred. Take the Helios ending. Choosing to merge sees JC walk into the chamber, merge with Helios, and that's it. No extra cutscene showing the future, no showcasing of the ending's ramifications. Nope. Just nothing. The same applies to Tracer Tong, which has JC blowing up the base before the game cuts to black. This one I was most disappointed in, as they could have shown how the world was impacted by the destruction of the net, or if it even had been affected at all, because as it stands, we like the world are left in the dark as to what happened. Each ending does come with a quote, which is a nice touch, but it mainly just reinforces what the endings are about. The Helios path ends with a quote from philosopher Voltaire that says if there were no God, it'd be necessary to invent him, referring to how humans, for as much as we like to have free will, find comfort in being ordered around by a higher power, such as God. God in all religions instructs those who believe in the faith on how to live. That's why Christians give up meat for Lent, or why Muslims pray multiple times a day. These rules keep people in line, but it's to serve a higher power, someone that in turn will grant them guidance and happiness in this life and after. This JC Helios combo would be the invented god of the new world. They would be the ultimate rulers of the world. And while that's a solid start, we don't know much about JC's attitude as much of it is shaped by the player, and the same goes for Helios. Still, the vibe of the endings, if we can call it that, is still strong. The moral conundrums of not being able to discern what is best for the world are the kind of endings I enjoy. I always end up pausing the game during times like this and talking about these endings out loud to myself in order to come to a proper conclusion, which was only possible because I was narratively invested in what the game was about. It put me in the shoes of JC Denton, and I felt like I needed to make the best choice here. Feeling this way does not come from every game. A bad game wouldn't bother with this, and most of your discussion about the ending would be less about which one is the best for the world, and more like which one is the fastest way to the end credits. Deus Ex is truly a masterclass of storytelling, and for this kind of thing to exist in the year 2000 is almost unheard of. It's a timeless classic and easily one of the most important games of all time, and most of the public agreed too. While the game didn't exactly sell well even by 2000 standards, only achieving 1 million sales in 2009, 9 years after release, the critical reception was largely positive, with scores rarely hitting a low of 8 while most gave it 9s and 10s. What's more important though is that Warren Spector was able to make his dream game, and what a dream of a game it was. It's only natural though that a sequel would follow. But how do you make a sequel to one of the most impressive games of all time? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that, but I can say with absolute certainty that Invisible War is not the correct one. While initial sales and reviews were met with positivity, many people in retrospect, including Warren Spector himself, see Invisible War as the weakest entry in the series. The game is the antithesis of everything that made the first game great. There were some valiant attempts to replicate the beauty of the original, but a lot of it fails to meet that standard. Most of this comes from the oversimplification of the old systems. There are no longer different calibers of ammo and various types of ammo within the same caliber, as all ammo within the guns is universal. Logins, passwords, or keycodes no longer need to be typed out and instead are just able to be opened if you have the respective code. Health is no longer split between your limbs, but is now just a singular health bar. Skills and augments are now just morphed into augments. And multi-tools, ironically enough, actually live up to their name and are a multi-purpose tool, keeping their original purpose, but also gaining the ability to unlock things you would otherwise need a lockpick for. As much as it sounds like I'm complaining about this though, I don't really mind it. Mostly. Deus Ex was quite rough around the edges, and Invisible War does attempt to smooth out those edges, but it ends up going too far. The gameplay isn't bad enough for me to dislike it, but I'm also not dropping to my knees and screaming, how could something this genius possibly be created by a mere human? It's okay. It functions, and that's about it. And this extends to most of the game, including its story. It does things, that's for sure, but I have no strong feelings about it either way. What a real shit position that is for me to be in. A good game is fun to talk about because you get to gush about its beauty and impressive quality. And if it's a bad game, I can lament about its systems, offer constructive criticism, or just simply share something that didn't quite work out the way it was intended. I struggled to do either of that with Invisible War, as it's right in the middle. Not bad, not good, but boring. Most of my playtime was just spent idly playing, not really engaging with the content in front of me because of its utter failure to keep me interested. The world of Invisible War feels as lifeless as the game itself. What made Deus Ex shine was its attention to detail. NPCs were walking and talking with each other, and some may have even gotten threatened. Like this boy in Hong Kong who you could follow for a solid 10 minutes, and within that time berates this woman, reports back to the luminous path, goes back expecting money, reports his success to the guard, and then goes back to the kiosk to do what he was told to do. All of that happens independently of the player and can be missed if they don't pay attention. Almost all the NPCs in this game sit in the same area and never move around. They are lifeless bodies that only exist so that the player has someone to talk to, rather than feeling like an actual person in the world. One of its biggest failings, though, is actually one of its biggest innovations: the factions. Invisible War gives the player the ability to join up with various factions and now occupy the land. For context, Invisible War takes place 20 years after the first game, and due to what was called the collapse, the world has been sort of splintered, leaving newer groups the opportunity to pop up and reap the benefits. This also sounds like the Dark Age ending, implying that that option was canon, but it's not that simple, and I'll explain why later. But these new groups consist of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, the Order, and the Omar. The WTO is a very basic military faction that has gone head-to-head with the Order, a religious fanatical cult of sorts that despises augmented people and want to purge the world of all biomodification. Once you leave the tutorial area, you can choose which objectives you want to accomplish. If your values align more with the WTO and their love for capitalism and commerce, then you can join them. But if you want to join the Order, even though you yourself are a biomodified human, then you can be their lackey too. The issue is that all of the decisions you make won't matter anyway. The game is nice enough to label each objective by who gave it to you, but more often than not you can do both since each group has different goals. Here in Cairo, the Order wants me to find out a cure for the plague polluting the city, while the WTO wants you to destroy a greenhouse. While this could provide a morally interesting choice, the player can just do both with very little consequence. This is also further compounded by the fact that Cairo is the only location you come back to. Unlike the previous games where your actions could evolve and change, allowing you to see the consequences of your actions, many of the decisions are never seen due to the game's insistence on giving you new locations to explore, rather than the old ones. In all fairness, not every decision is like this. Sometimes the choices you make can be heard about at a news station, which is about the laziest way you could do it, but at least they consider the fact that players might be curious to hear about what happened as a result of their choice. There are also a few missions where the two groups' ideals do intersect, like when you have to choose between sparing or killing a specific NPC. Where this drops the ball, though, is the lack of consequence. Minus one moment, most of these missions result in the opposing side angrily calling you, disappointed that you would side with the enemy. It's like the equivalent of internet bullying. All bark, no bite. That one moment, though, did admittedly catch me by surprise, but even that was met with dissatisfaction. I had decided in Egypt to do the WTO missions first and then the Orders. Well, the second in command of the Order didn't like that I did the WTO missions, so she called me letting me know that I betrayed the organization and that a hit squad was on their way to kill me. Which is exactly what happens. However, not only was this the only time this ever happened among all the factions, but the second in command called me after I dealt with them and basically said, "You survived this, but I hope you learn that we are not to be messed with, and you'll follow our orders next time." You just sent armed thugs to take me out. I feel like we passed a point of no return regarding our friendship like 5 steps ago. This is also, of course, not even mentioning the fact that both of these factions specifically work for the same group. Both the leaders of the WTO and the Order are members of the Illuminati. They did this so that the people could have healthy competition. The WTO is a capitalistic and commercialized group of people, while the Order completely opposes those exact ideals. Among, of course, the more sinister belief that they don't like biomodifications. The plan was eventually to unite the world through these groups and bring them under one secular society, which would create their new world order. Part of me understands why this is here, because the game wants to make the player feel disappointed and worthless, that all their decisions were pointless, because all they were essentially doing was stoking the fires between each group, which only served to grow the Illuminati more. Like how there's 24 different chocolate brands under the same name, so no matter which one you buy, the house always wins. But this doesn't work here as everything is meaningless. This whole mechanic was designed to give the player the freedom to choose which faction they want to support, but it doesn't go anywhere since there was never any choice to begin with. The causes and effects were all fabricated. A lie spun by the Illuminati and the game, hoping that you'd be stupid enough to engage with the series' best idea that it has had so far. The game even does this again with a coffee company that's more akin to the example I just used, where two companies named Pequod and Queequid are at odds with one another and you're able to assist one of the companies by completing a job for them, only to find out that both companies are owned by the same brand, so the rivalry was made just to stoke the fires and push sales, all while the actual owners of the businesses are worried about losing their jobs. All this is an attempt by the game to lure you in, only to pull the rug out from under you. The game is all about rug pulling, constantly ripping it out from under you with every choice and decision you make until you decide that enough is enough and you rip it up yourself. In a game design context, that is problematic, as you start to look at the missions from a mechanical perspective and not a narrative one. Yeah, I could kill the headmaster of a school who plans to kill all these children because he's secretly working for the Templars and they hate biomodified people, or I could report it to the police and get a citizen's bonus and then hope they follow up on their job. I could also enroll a girl into that school, even though that would basically be the equivalent of signing her death sentence, but her mother's paying me, and I like money. It's the exact same problem we talked about in the previous section. Being narratively invested in the fiction has you taking a simple request like this with extreme care and consideration, but doing so means you're already more invested in the game than it is in itself. To top this all off, we have the third group that I've been neglecting to talk about, the Omar, and they might be the most disappointing of them all due to their underutilization in the plot as a whole. The Omar are a group of over-modified beings who only care about being the strongest and using the top-of-the-line modifications, even the ones that are illegal. They also modified their prefrontal lobes of the cortical interface so that all the Omar are under one collective hive mind. It's highly disturbing, and even though the visuals aren't doing them any justice, the idea that they are more machine than man is easy enough to understand. They are opposites to some of the factions in this game, as those groups would prefer the world to be organic and normal, while the Omar see themselves as the next evolutionary step for humanity. All of that is fantastic, and they are still by many metrics my favorite faction in the game. But that's just what they are in the lore. In game, they're little more than black market dealers. All the Omar do in the game is sit in a secluded area of the map and sell you items. They might even give you a discount if you perform a service for them. But none of the services have anything to do with the other factions or the plot at large, as most having you kill specific people and then finding their enhanced biomodifications that you can scan them and give them to the Omar. It's the worst possible way to drop the ball, as the most interesting faction in this whole game are just merchants. The factions of Invisible War are its most ambitious and worst mechanic in the game. Giving the player the option to choose who they want to side with is such a great idea, as it further expands the play how you want plan that Warren Spector wanted for the series. But the factions themselves are lifeless, hollow, not likable, and rarely important, which is a problem as their never-ending conflicts are the central plot of the game. Invisible War may have a major focus on factions, but it also has a major focus on its protagonist, Alex D. Set 20 years in the future, Alex was sent to a place called Tarsus Academy to be trained for humanity's future. The trainees here would undergo many exams and tests to be selected for a variety of jobs, ranging from world leaders to security guards. Originally, he was stationed in Chicago, until terrorists came by and blew up the whole facility along with most of the city, forcing them to go to their branch in Seattle. Joining Alex is 3 other trainees, Clara, Billy, and Leo. It's eventually discovered though that this Tarsus Academy is just a front for a group called Apostle Corps, who made the company to experiment on the trainees. That's because Apostle Corps is run by J.C. Denton. This group wasn't mentioned in the ending though, which begs the question of what ending was actually chosen. Well, the answer is all of them. So firstly, the how. Well, despite each of these endings requiring different steps and ending in multiple different ways, canonically, JC merged with Helios, killed Bob Page, blew up Area 51, causing the Aquinas network to go dark, and then tried to join the Illuminati, except the merging caused severe damage to JC, forcing him to be put into suspended animation for the time being. As for the why, well, I don't actually know. All we have is a comment from one of the devs who just thought that all the endings at once would be better than just one. Usually, 3 heads are better than 1, but 3 is also a crowd. Still, I don't mind the decision, mainly because it kept the one thing I cared about, which was the dark age of the internet, and that is what gave birth to the collapse. A period where all over the world, countries were at war and the world was plunged into an economic recession. It's the start of a very interesting post-apocalypse/dystopian setting. Too bad most of the levels we explore look fine and untattered, or sometimes even better off than you would expect, which doesn't exactly connect well to the ending, but the idea is there. JC is doing all this with Apostle Corps though because they need someone with his DNA, and that's why the trainees, including Alex, were undergoing so many tests. Oddly enough, Alex Denton was teased back in the first game. In Area 51 there are tankers filled with clones, one of which is named Alex Denton. Back then it was a scary reminder that JC is nothing more than a tool and could have been easily replaced, just like how we replaced Paul by taking on his missions and using his contacts. But now it's used as a method of foreshadowing. But Apostle Corps should have probably left him in the tank for a bit longer, or at least taught him some basic communication skills, because he approaches every conversation without even a hint of personality. He is quite possibly the blandest character I've ever listened to.
Hi, what's going on? It looks like this facility is under attack. I appreciate that. Listen, I'm serious. You didn't hear the explosions? I saw a guard killed right in front of me on the apartment level.
The trainees we meet are a bit better, but their quality does vary depending on who we talk about. Each of the trainees have their own journeys that they go on throughout the game, and is the one thing that the player can see evolve in real time due to their decisions. The 3 of them all go to different organizations after realizing Tarsus and Apostle Corps were just using them. Billy goes to the Order, Clara to the WTO, and Leo to the Omar. Clara's story isn't exactly interesting, but it is realistic, as she wanted to join the WTO to uphold their values. She'll join you on a couple missions, and then tell you about how well she's doing at the WTO. And even though she does learn that it's really the Illuminati pulling the strings, she says that she still believes in the WTO, just not its leader, which is a bit of a naive way of looking at things, but I kinda get it. It eventually ends with her being kidnapped by the WTO, forcing us to comply with what the Illuminati wants us to do or have her die as a consequence. You can, however, rescue her yourself before that happens, which is a nice touch, and she'll be grateful, saying that she's going to quit the organization and live a normal life back in Seattle, further remarking that all this training she did was about killing people and she doesn't want to do that anymore. It's not the most riveting arc for a character to take, but it makes sense and I respect it. Leo's arc is the opposite and was quite interesting to see unfold. Leo starts off as this cocky asshole that's full of himself, but after learning of Tarsus, he goes solo for a while and picks up some odd security jobs here and there until he's recruited by the Omar. Most of his journey is spent doing just that, being security for the Omar dealers until later when we see that they gave him one of their suits, which is the phase 1 of their transformation. He's eventually going to be selected for phase 2, which is when he'll receive that interface and be put in the hive mind, but he's getting cold feet about going all the way. This, however, upsets the Omar, who would tell him that they would do it by force if he didn't comply. But we can help him escape if we have enough money, which leads to him leaving the organization. It's a nice parallel to his time at Tarsus, as he's being used as a tool for someone else's gain again. His final moment is actually a part of an ending which we'll talk about later, but going down this route would be able to give him the ability to choose how to live his life and do what he wants to do for the first time, which is a really great end to his story. Billy, on the other hand, bothers me greatly. Billy is the main character among the trainees, as she is seen in the opening cutscene, and is the only friend of Alex's prior to entering the Tarsus Academy. That's why her eventual betrayal to ally with the Knights Templar hurts even more, as she was a close friend. Pretty much all of it is fine, honestly. My only real complaint is the group she's joining. She eventually starts with the Order before moving to the Templars, who are like a more fanatical version of them. Yet Billy is a biomodified agent, so she's working for an organization hell-bent on eliminating people like her, which strikes me as weird. Billy also doesn't show up for most of the game, so it's hard to tell what actually swayed her opinion on this. If there was maybe a moment where she renounces her augmentations, saying that she had these put onto her by force and believes that they have actively made her life worse, which is why the world should be purged of them, then that's a perfectly normal reason to join the Templars. But she doesn't explain why, she just agrees with their ideals, not really confronting the fact that she is among the people they hate. Still, the trainees are a nice addition to the game, as they are similar in structure to Sandra from the first game, a person who you'll meet across the game whose life will be impacted by her decisions for good or ill, and those are the kind of stories I enjoy most in this series. Like the first game, the initial act is the tamest part of the story, but it's also ironically the most confusing. Due to the missions being split across the factions, I was initially confused as to where the story was even going. Each group just had you doing different objectives that conveniently take place in the same locations, and it took a while for me to understand where all of this was leading to, which is right when I was told that they were two sides of the same coin. While the locations themselves are a noticeable downgrade from the previous games, it does at least keep some of the personality of the first game by giving the player multiple options to approach a given objective, and for most of the levels to have tons of secondary objectives to do in them. Now, as I said, most of these objectives aren't narratively important and should only be done for the gameplay benefits they could provide, but I am glad that they at least carried that over from the prior game. Where the end of this act begins is towards the end of Cairo. As while the two groups do have their differences, they both want Alex to find out more information on Apostle Corps, which makes sense given that they're both under the same faction. The Illuminati, Apostle Corps, and the Knights Templar are the three main factions of the game, who will ask Alex for help in furthering their goals all the way to the end, where they provide you with an ending to the game itself. Just like the WTO and the Order, they also have their own conflicts of interest regarding certain topics, which force you to choose who to go with. Unfortunately, that too doesn't matter. A hypothetical point of no return doesn't exist in Invisible War right until you push the final button that officially locks in your ending. Until then, you can do as many different objectives as you want or outright work against a specific faction by constantly foiling their plans, only for them to still let you join them and take on their ending. I can understand wanting the player to see all the content, but locking the player out of content would be a perfect excuse for another playthrough. Not that I want to do another playthrough of Invisible War, but it would be a reason to do one if I wanted to. Where the story starts to take a turn is just after learning about the Illuminati scheme to use the two groups against each other, as after this we go through a portal to Antarctica, which is where JC is currently being held. Thanks to him being in control of Area 51 at the time, he was also able to avoid the help of the aliens located here. While this is already a very wild piece of lore to include in the game, I'm honestly not a huge fan of how the game handles aliens, and it reminds me a lot of what Fallout 3 did to aliens in that series. In the original Fallout, aliens were a secret event that you could come across. It was meant as dumb fun though, as it played into the 1950s era of Fallout. When Bethesda acquired the rights of the game, they ended up evolving the aliens into more than just a joke by making them a canonical part of the world and then made the player spend an entire DLC on board one of the ships. It was so very clearly a joke, but they went way too far with the bit, which makes the whole situation rather funny since it is easily the worst DLC of that game. In Deus Ex, Area 51 and VersaLife both had aliens, both of which were owned by Majestic 12. Them experimenting on aliens just showed how much power and technology they had, and it also played into the real Majestic 12. Except in both games, it's clarified that the aliens aren't really aliens, but people who were genetically modified. They aren't really aliens, they just happen to look like a traditional alien somehow. This isn't really Invisible War's fault though, as it's the first game that did start this, but Invisible War allows you to talk and interact with them, and I feel like both games' inclusions take away their alien-ishness, and it never sat right with me. Once we make it to the core of the base, we come across JC Denton for the first time, who tells us a bit about his plan for the world. While the first part of the game is all about setting up the Illuminati and confusing you the whole way through, the second part is all about the factions telling you their plans, which will be important as you will ultimately have to choose who to side with. In a nice thematic twist, the game ends where the series begins, at Liberty Island. Each of the three groups have dug themselves into a section of the island while carefully planning ways to kill off the others. Now once again, the game isn't really showcasing that quite well, as the groups are so far apart from each other that they rarely interact at all, but that's more on account of the engine itself and not the game's design. You're also given allies in this level, taking the form of whoever you chose to side with in the previous mission, which ultimately serves to make this whole ending extremely disjointed, as you go into this mission with allies that you can then betray right at the end. The first group you'll come across is JC and possibly Paul, depending on your actions in the previous mission. Their vision for the world has been to make one fully connected universe using Helios. Unlike many civilizations that see humanity as chaotic, something that needs to be ruled over and controlled, JC and Helios see it as something to be welcomed, as long as the individuals are equal on all fronts. JC asks if it's fair that one child be born into an impoverished life with very little food and money, while one gets born into a wealthy family and flush with more money than most will ever see. These differences splinter humanity and ultimately cause more problems, but according to JC, if everyone was enhanced to a level playing field, then the world could improve. This ending essentially ends up creating a perfected version of democracy. Helios has all the power to handle all the branches of government at once. If everyone is connected to Helios, major judicial decisions can be done on a daily, if not more frequent basis. I gotta be honest, I didn't exactly expect this level of complexity from Invisible War, as it not only fleshes out the idea Helios had in the first game, but it also oddly enough corrects current criticisms of democracy to make the ending seem more compelling. For as great as democratic society can be, it's not without its faults. A democratic government usually has a system for how it handles things, which causes things to get backed up and take longer than they should. In a recent study about this topic, it was discovered that most Supreme Court cases on average take about 586 days to be completed. Through Helios, this would be shrunken down to less than a day. Another fault of the system is the constant switching of policies every election year. Since the president can change as quick as once every 4 years, most of their early legislations are the removal of laws and bills created by their predecessor. To put it another way, former President Donald Trump has been very vocal about his stance on immigration, going as far as to build a wall near the southern border. But when Biden was elected back in 2020, he immediately halted production on the wall. Assuming Trump gets re-elected next year, I have no doubt that this policy will once again return. This back and forth switching can be problematic, not just for the everyday citizen who has to keep up with all this, but also for the country, as the first year for most presidents' terms is just spent playing catch-up. And while JC didn't explicitly say this, I can assume he and Helios will be the world's rulers, so their policies will never change and the world can always be on the path of progress. The only fault of JC's plan is actually not with democracy itself, but rather his version of it, as this connection with Helios would be a complete invasion of privacy. It's important to point out that the people would be connected, not assimilated into Helios as opposed to someone like the Omar. But being connected all the time would be exhausting and wouldn't allow for any kind of personal freedom. It's like the grid zoning law from the first game. The rights and freedoms of the individual should be balanced around their safety. And is gaining a bit of safety worth losing some to all of your privacy? The second group attempting to stake claim in the world is once again the Illuminati. Just like before, they want to rule the world from the shadows. They want to know and handle all the business transactions in the world while also being on top at every possible step. They are by far the easiest to understand, as the only thing that's actually changed is their management, who specifically are a nice callback to the first game, as their leaders are Chad Dumier and Nicolette DuClaire. Chad was the leader of Silhouette, a French militia group who opposed MJ-12, and Nicolette was the daughter of Beth DuClaire, a former Illuminati member and someone we met with previously. Under their control, the Illuminati would get exactly what they want, while also ruling over the world via the use of an AI called Ophelia, who's stationed at a giant spaceship circling the Earth. This would also prevent the Illuminati from ever being overtaken again, like the incident with Bob Page, as now they exist outside the confines of Earth. This ending also happens to be the more ambiguous of the bunch, as the game doesn't show what the world is like for the common folk of the world, but the ending narration does seem to imply that the world is growing, thriving, and is safe. The third group asking for Alex's assistance is the Knights Templar. As I said before, they were a more fanatical version of the Order, and that's because they originally started from there. While the group did exist before the collapse, the new post-collapse Templars were led by Luminon Saman, a former member of the Order who felt that the Order was drifting too far away from its original ideals. So rather than fix it from the inside, Saman decided to create a whole new group. Saman chose to reignite the Templars because his ideals fit neatly with that of the old Templars during the Crusades. The Templars back then fought many wars with the Middle East in an attempt to reclaim the Holy Land and stop Muslim expansion. And the new Templars under Saman want to continue this, but against biomodifications and the push to install yourself with multiple mechanical systems. This is why Billy's decision to ally with them still bothers me, because she's working for people who would see her as a stain on the earth, and I don't recall the game ever mentioning why she joined in the first place, only that she did because of her hatred for Apostle Corps. This is further reinforced by their end slide, which shows a few bodies hanging from the rafters, while Saman preaches to the group about their sermons. While the group ultimately opposes the concept of biomodification, as their objective is to use counter nanites to remove the mods in people's body without hurting the host, it's clear that they don't mind a bit of murder if it furthers their goal. Doing this would not only strengthen their forces, but it would also weaken the Illuminati, as they depend on these upgrades for their own ambitions, giving Saman and the Templars complete control of the world. Like before, while some of the endings may be more palatable than others, they all come with their own baggage, which is why Invisible War allows you to enact a fourth ending, where you kill all the leaders of the game, JC, Paul, Chad, Nicolette, and Saman, and let the world decide for itself. All of the leaders want to control the world to fit their own ideals and needs. This ending would allow the people, the common folk, to do it themselves. To quote the big boss himself, it's not about changing the world, it's about doing our best to leave the world the way it is. This, however, in a rather comedic way, ends up resulting in the worst ending possible. As for the next 200 years, the world will be caught up in constant wars with a strong rule of the weak, eventually giving birth to a complete Mad Max-style post-apocalypse. I initially found this ending to be quite funny, as it's basically saying that leaving people to their own devices would cause all-out war, but it does pose a rather interesting question about whether or not the world should be ruled by a governing body, as without some kind of control the world could be chaotic. That said, you could argue that this destruction was inevitable, and that at the very least, the world delved into chaos on its own terms, rather than on the terms of a few high-up government officials who wanted to play war. Clearly there is a lot of depth to these options, which is helped by the fact that unlike the original game, Invisible War actually shows you the endings from a vision of the future and not the present, giving the player a chance to actually speculate on what the endings are about, rather than trying to piece together what actually happened. All things considered, Invisible War does go out in a really strong way. It's a shame that the rest of the game couldn't pull its weight though. Invisible War is an unfortunate creation, and while I can recognize that a sequel to the original was never going to be a masterpiece due to Deus Ex's sheer level of quality, Invisible War is most definitely a few steps down from that. The gameplay was acceptable and existed, and this hollow feeling that rarely sparked any sort of stimulation in me was carried across the story. The idea of allying with factions was its most innovative idea, but it was also its biggest downfall. As choices didn't matter, factions were designed not to go against each other so that the player could experience all the content in one playthrough, and the few times it did overlap resulted in nothing more than a simple consequence in the moment. The levels and side missions were also lacking the life and energy that the previous game had brought to the table. Missions were more interesting when in the context of the reward and not the narrative impact, and the NPCs felt like talking bodies rather than actual people. As a sequel to Deus Ex, Invisible War is awful, but even as a standalone experience, it is still hopelessly mediocre. And that mediocrity is almost what killed the series, as after Invisible War, Deus Ex would go under an 8-year hiatus before the release of 2011's Human Revolution. A new game with a new team, new engine, and new ideas. Human Revolution can be best summarized as the modern-day Deus Ex. It takes what made the original game great, but changes things to fit a more modern audience. Like Invisible War, systems are simplified so things flow more naturally, but it doesn't go too far. Augmentations are easier to acquire and understand, but are more diverse, allowing for tons of replayability. The gunplay feels nicer and smoother to use, and many other decisions. While I do think new players to the series should start with the original Deus Ex, if for some odd reason you're put off by its older systems or don't have a PC handy, Human Revolution is a perfect substitute. While there are certainly a few things to be disappointed about, it's a game that's better than the sum of its parts, and it's still to me the best game in the series. One thing that will be immediately clear upon starting the game is how much has changed. 8 years is a hell of a gap, long enough to go through a whole console generation, meaning Human Revolution is now working with the Xbox 360 and PS3. And thanks to this, the game is able to add more to the environments than ever before. Areas are much larger in this game, sometimes doubling the length of areas seen in the prior games, all of which are rarely separated by a loading screen. Certain areas are closed off and do require a whole new area to load for them to function, but you pretty much go from end to end without ever stopping. These levels are also filled to the brim with life. Each location is chock full of NPCs and extremely complicated looking architecture that probably took months to nail down. You'll also notice that the color scheme has changed too, going from a more dark and oppressive black and blue to a more inviting black and yellow, so much in fact that Wiz Khalifa might even enjoy the game. What's wild is that it isn't even the game's final form, as the footage you're seeing is from the Director's Cut edition, which among many things removed much of the gold filter that was present in the original. While I do think the new edition does look better, part of me always wished they commit to the bit all the way to the end. Among these locations are also quite a few side quests the player can embark on, which further serve to flesh out the world of Human Revolution. Unlike the first game though, most of these missions don't have multi-stage objectives like our meeting with Sandra, as they opted to streamline the missions instead, making them easier and simpler to understand. However, what it leaves behind it replaces with its own story that fits more in line with the game's theme. Human Revolution is a prequel to the entire series, so in story order this is the one you would play first. While this is not only a genius move on its own, as this is a game that is trying to garner both old and new fans, so setting the game as the first in the series means new fans wanting to be caught up, it also creates an interesting dissonance within the series, as its sequel, Mankind Divided, while later in the timeline, is still before the classic games. Which means if you play the games in release order, you're going forward in technology but backwards in time, but forward in time and backwards in technology if you played in story order. I would recommend that you play it in release order though, as some of its story makes sense when you have the full context of the past two games. This change in narrative that I mentioned earlier though is regarding its main thematic plot, which is robot racism. To further explain, both Human Revolution and Mankind Divided stories hinge on the relationship between augmentations and the people of the world. To many in this era of Deus Ex, augmentations are more divisive than you may think, as some people find it to be dangerous, unregulated, and unnatural. This has led to lots of political and societal talks about what to do with augmentations, as there are clearly supporters for each group. Most of the game's side quests and aforementioned main plot revolve around augmentations and what should be done with this newfound piece of technology. It also poses some rather interesting questions about our own world and how we treat others, as replace augmentations with skin tone or nationality, and this is just textbook racism. The main difference and counter-argument for many within the game world is that augmentations are not mandatory and are all based on choice, so unlike skin tone, these people chose to have them implanted. That's immediately challenged in a variety of missions that all deal with this subject matter. Take for instance the literal protagonist of the game, Adam Jensen, a man who works security for Seraph Industries, one of the biggest suppliers of augmentations throughout the world. The start of the game will have him killed while defending the facility, only for him to wake up 6 months later with 2 new mechanical arms. While it's very effective for his style of work, he is subjected to scrutiny that others would receive, even though he didn't have a choice. Fortunately for Adam, he is a menacing-looking killing machine, so not many people would want to challenge him, but for the rest of the common folk, it leads to immense discrimination and bigotry. Doubling down on this are 3 side missions I count among the game's best in terms of overall narrative and how they portray the different ways of the world. The first one is centered around an employee of Seraph Industries, who's currently caught up in a scheme but now wants out. Unfortunately, the guy he is working for has evidence of him committing this scheme, so he's using it as blackmail to keep him on the team. What he was doing was sneaking out neuropazine and giving it to the people in need. Neuropazine is the drug that is used to help the mechanically augmented use their augments without their body rejecting it. Since you're basically attaching mechanical wires to an organic nervous system, the body blocks the electrical signals it produces, causing it to be little more than a paperweight. Neuropazine removes these blockers from the body, allowing the augmentations to function properly. Similar to ambrosia though, it only lasts so long. This time, a week of protection, so augmented users must get weekly doses for them to work. Failure to administer this drug will cause the body to build up tissue, creating more rejections, which could lead to something as small as dizziness to something more harmful like seizures or death. So augmented people are basically on a constant ticking timer that needs to be reset in order to stay alive. Due to this, some people are unable to afford those weekly doses. And that's not even considering the people like Adam who had it forced on them, and now not only can't pay for the surgery, but the lifetime supplies of neuropazine that they'll need. This is actually something some gangs and thugs use to keep people on their leash, so to speak, which is what occurs in this other side mission, as this group of prostitutes that work for this love hotel of sorts are being asked to get augmentations or they'll be fired. These women are likely not getting paid that much anyway, so the boss of the hotel could use his money as leverage to get them neuropazine, meaning that being fired after getting augmented will mean no money and no neuropazine to pay for your recently installed augments. One of the women working here asks us to find one of her coworkers who was kidnapped by a group of men who plan to do the same thing, force augmentations onto her, and then be her main supplier of neuropazine so she can't leave them. In a slightly different example, there was another woman named Jaya who owes money to the Triads here in Hangzhou, China, so we're going to be their debt collector. But as you would expect, the reason for the lack of payment isn't some frivolous reason. Jaya had always struggled in her life due to her rough upbringing, but was determined to be better than her family. The problem is Jaya was always behind her top classmates. Not because she was bad at school, actually quite the opposite, as she was the top of her class, but because the rich kids just paid their way to the top. Furthermore, her career, which is a professional broker, is filled with rich kids with top-of-the-line augmentations, some of which enhance their work, like being able to see a person's feelings and using that to win them over, which is actually something we can do in dialogue sometimes. Jai doesn't have money nor a rich family, so she needed help, which is why she went to the Triads to set up alone. Despite being in different circumstances, augmentations were something they either needed to get ahead or was forced on them to keep their job, reinforcing that augmentations aren't just cosmetic and more often than not is something a person needs in their life. Which makes the previous talk about neuropazine even worse, as it's another pound of baggage to add onto their lives. It's not only horrific to see how all these people have become affected by these inventions, even though their whole purpose was to uplift people, but it's also a grim reminder of the world we live in today. Neuropazine and how it's being distributed and used reminds me a lot of the world's distribution of insulin. While I'm fortunate enough to not have diabetes, anyone with it can tell you that buying insulin sucks. Similar to neuropazine, diabetics need this in order to survive, as without it you could develop diabetic ketoacidosis, which could be life-threatening if not treated. Historically though, the price of insulin has continued to grow every year, now reaching as high as $270 a vial, with most patients requiring more than 1 or 2 vials a month. Now while there has been some talks of insulin being pushed down to a much more affordable $35 a month, that's still an incredibly high markup for something that people literally need to survive. While we can't really determine a price for this kind of thing in-game, we do know that just like insulin, there is a monopoly over who produces neuropazine, allowing them to mark up the prices as they please. Outside of the financial issues, there's also the more pressing societal issues that come from being mechanically augmented. Some people are surprisingly open about their hostility towards these things, calling people augs, which is sometimes used as a slur in the game, to some outright saying that a no-augs policy would be a fantastic idea. The people of this world are openly bigoted towards their fellow humans simply because they have augmentations, and are willing to bring back segregation if it means they don't get to see these people again. It's why the side quest not being as complete as the original game still works in Human Revolution's favor, as it's shifting its priorities to fit the story it wants to tell. The saying goes that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, but to be fair, it's easier to keep track of all those eggs if they're in one place. Since the story is so hyper-focused on one aspect of the broader world, they're able to keep themselves on track without losing focus. We may not see the outcomes of these individuals and how their lives will have changed because of our help, but we will be able to see in the moment how their lives have been altered due to this game's world-defining invention. So the world of Deus Ex is discriminatory against people with augmentations. How does our protagonist fare within this conflict? Well, first, we have to explain how we got here. The first scene of the game starts with a talk between members of the Illuminati. The only one we can see, though, is Bob Page. Since this game is a prequel, many of the characters who died are naturally going to be alive again, but don't get used to seeing the Illuminati, as this will be the last time they appear throughout the game. Following this is a scene between Adam Jensen and his ex-girlfriend Megan Reed. Both work for Seraph Industries, but for different reasons. Jensen does security while Megan is a scientist. This creates some awkward moments, as it's the equivalent of your ex being your coworker. You don't want to see them, but you still have to show up to work. There does seem to be some unresolved feelings though, as Megan has a toy cop car in her office, which was a joke gift that she got herself since Adam picked her up in a cop car for their first date. Their dynamic and how it expertly showcases the feeling of two lovers that fell apart but still love each other in some way is also helped by the fact that both of their voice actors are married to each other. As much as I love JC though, I have a real soft spot for Adam. His voice actor is Elias Tefexis, whose most recent role was Sam Coe in Bethesda's Starfield. Their voices are so similar though that I've always called Sam a space cowboy version of Adam Jensen.
I never asked for this. They say they saved me, but I'm not sure saved is the right word.
This, like many things, was likely done as a way to pay homage to its older roots, as both protagonists wear trench coats and glasses despite the attire being completely unnecessary. Moreover, Alex Robinson and Pritchard are similar in that they both serve as the hacker friend of the protagonist. And Jock, our old pilot, is now replaced with Farida Malik. The game's music is also trying to replicate the synthetic sounds of the original, and as a nice nod to that score, radios throughout the game might play tracks directly from the original soundtrack. Deus Ex is an important series, and one that needed to be handled with care. It's clear that Eidos Montreal wanted to keep the original in mind, as they too saw what made the first game great, and so dedicated their time to making sure they could do that with their game. Unlike the music, which I still think goes to the original Deus Ex, the cast of Human Revolution is one I enjoy more. Both Pritchard and Malik have their own unique personalities and even their own missions that the player can assist them with. Farida is a charming pilot who will help Jensen to get where he needs to go. Her mission takes place in Hengsha, where she wants Jensen to look into her friend's death that she believes was mishandled. Come to find out, it was, as the boyfriend found out that she was pregnant and killed her to make it look like an accident so he didn't have to raise the kid. It's a pretty brutal tale, but given how nice Malik is, it's only fair that we help her in her time of need. She, like Jock, also has a circumstance that can determine their fate. Back in the original, before leaving the Illuminati headquarters, you can find a mechanic who's doing an absolutely poor job at hiding the fact that he is not a mechanic. If you need more proof though, you can find the body of the actual mechanic nearby. Reporting this to Jock has him remark how a bomb was attached to the helicopter, but thanks to JC, he was able to remove it. Malik gets in her own bind when the helicopter crashes, and you can choose to leave or help her, resulting in her death if you choose the former. Pritchard, on the other hand, is incredibly annoying, but it's how he was designed. He and Jensen go back and forth all the time, ripping on each other for even the smallest things, and while it's annoying, there's some of my favorite types of characters, as they always seem to have some issue that needs solving, which usually makes them come around to the protagonist. Which is what happens with Pritchard regarding some security issue with the company that turns into an investigation into Jensen's past. That said, for annoying as he can be, he has some pretty good taste in games, as located in the back of his office is a poster for Final Fantasy XXVII. While the team behind the game was Eidos Montreal, Eidos Interactive is owned by Square Enix, so it checks out. Quite optimistic of them to assume though that we would be on Final Fantasy XXVII by the year 2027, since it's already 2023 and we're only on 16. Getting to the point, I really like the cast of this game, and while not all of them will reappear in the sequel, they were still able to make a likable cast of characters within the limited screen time that they were given. Returning to the plot, while Jensen follows Megan, we get a pretty good look at what goes on behind the scenes at Seraph Industries, and one major criticism of augmentations is its use in warfare. War over the years has gotten deadlier and more destructive, and this augmented tech would further push that boundary, such as this Typhon launcher, which launches a spread of grenades around the user, inflicting harm on anyone nearby. Which, while bad enough as is made all the worse when we too can use this tech, meaning anyone with enough money could just buy this and take out quite a few innocent people. Megan does assure both us and Jensen that while some of their contracts are from the Department of Defense, her goal is specifically to enhance the human body, not destroy it. Which is where she is currently taking us, as Megan is set to present a recent finding of hers that, for a lack of a better word, will unlock the parts of our DNA that have always been hidden. The wording there is quite specific and has been used to placate most people who see augmentations as new things added to the body, as this would simply unlock what was already there. It's eventually learned though that this discovery was because of Adam. Another connection to the original games that the main character is not a normal everyday person, but an experiment crafted by an organization. Adam as a kid was taken to a place called White Helix Labs, where the kids would undergo gene therapy experiments. All of the kids ended up dying except Adam, which is why his genes were so important. 2 workers couldn't bear the guilt of working there though, so they burned the whole facility down and had Adam taken to his family so they would raise him on his own. All of this happened not only without his consent, but without his knowledge, as Adam has no idea about this unless you complete a very specific side quest. Which, on that topic, this game includes a surprising amount of hands-off moments like this, where details are mentioned or quests are given without requiring the player to do them. The origin of Adam and why he is so special is a side quest, when usually this would be fit into the main script somehow. But it wasn't, as the game isn't about Adam, but augmentations as a whole. As a result though, Adam is the only person in the world that we know of who doesn't need neuropazine, because his body bonds so well with his augmentations that blockers aren't necessary. This is the discovery that Megan wants to present, as if they could take Adam's DNA, replicate it, then put it in a biochip, people could share all the same qualities that he has, meaning neuropazine would no longer be needed. Now once again, Adam has no idea about this and won't be told unless you figure it out for yourself, so to him he's just escorting his ex-girlfriend to a meeting. That is until his meeting with the company's CEO David Seraph, where an alarm goes off during their talk, forcing them to cut it short so he can figure out what happened. What he originally thought was a bad accident turns into a complete hostile takeover, as 3 Spec Op members of a private military group called Bell Tower have attacked the facility, with the intention of destroying their work and taking Megan and her scientists with them. This is where Adam is killed, only to be awoken 6 months later with new arms. However, similar to RoboCop, just because you're dead doesn't mean you can't come into work, as Adam is naturally back to working with Seraph as security and he already has a new job for him. One of their industrial plants is being attacked by a pro-human group who hate augmentations, so Adam has to go down there and get rid of the attackers. From the start though, the game is trying to plant breadcrumbs that point to a much larger conspiracy going on, as within their ranks is a hacker with neuro-augmentations, something quite rare for a pro-human group. The guy's body is later examined, which does confirm that he is indeed augmented, along with a location of another hacker who is working off-site, away from the conflict. Following this lead brings us to a remote facility, which is of course owned by the ever-nefarious FEMA. Unfortunately, FEMA is rarely mentioned in this game outside of this one interaction, but referring to our prior discussion, they really are rounding up people and putting them in internment camps, just like the old conspiracy claimed they did. Guarding these places is not only more of the Bell Tower guys, but the same Spec Ops guards that killed Jensen 6 months ago. These 3 are a part of the game's 3 boss fights, and they are quite disappointing. Human Revolution's development was tight. As such, the team needed to outsource some of the production to get things ready and on time. One of which was the boss fights, and it seems like the original team knew this wasn't up to par with their standards, as the director's cut specifically adds new changes to these fights alone. But it's like the old analogy I love to use, which is putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. The director's cut can only do so much to solve the problem, but it won't fix it permanently, as the problem is never on the outer edges of its design. The entire core needs to be ripped out and replaced if it's going to fix it. I say this because each fight is more or less a competition to see who can pepper the other with bullets faster. Take Yeona's fight for example. Her boss fight is this large circular room with lots of cover and a few lockers to take ammo from. In the original, this was the only location. The director's cut adds doors to either side, which give you access to a second floor where you either disperse gas into the room below, or hack the turrets to fight for you. You might be seeing the problem already though, as all the director's cut does is give you more flavors of death. There is a severe lack of conversational and non-lethal options in this entry. Going non-lethal is a valid strategy, but the following cutscene creates an immense disconnect tonally, as you can use a stun gun for the whole fight, only for the cutscene to make it look like you coated them with bullets. Also, despite the game having a very in-depth conversational system, it refuses to let you talk to these three and possibly talk them down as a result. This mechanic also comes from an augmentation, so it's not something every player will have available to them, and it allows you to choose dialogue options related to their personality, so you can get what you want out of them, yet you aren't able to use it for the fight. Mechanically, they are quite a mess at times, but I find that it struggles just as much narratively, as the only connection we have to them is that they were the ones who attacked Jensen 6 months ago. All we know is that they were hired by the Illuminati to make sure things go their way, which is a real step down from the prior Deus Ex games, as there was at least some kind of relationship with these individuals that gave you a chance to understand them more. Human Revolution's boss fights feel like an attempt to cash in on the industry trend of including boss fights in games even though it didn't really need any. Killing Barrett provides Jensen with his next location, Hengsha, China, which is where we'll find our hacker. Just like Detroit, Hengsha has its own problems with augmentations, but the visuals refuse to back down, as the game is just as gorgeous as before, maybe even better in some ways. It's truly impressive just how well this game holds up 12 years later. Some of the character models have definitely shown their age, and the game's use of FMV cutscenes instead of in-engine ones is a surprising but not wholly unwelcome choice, but the actual environments themselves haven't aged a day. Hiding within the city is our hacker Windmill. Through him we find out who hired him, which was Taiyang Medical CEO Zhao, who is Seraph Industries' biggest competitor. Talking to him allows us to get an employee card that'll give us access to their headquarters so we can meet Zhao herself. As you've likely noticed by now, this entire plot has been one wild goose chase, and it's only going to get worse, as what halts our current chase is yet another one. When we meet with Zhao, she talks about how Megan's team was fit with GPL trackers that allow Seraph to keep track of their movements. The reason we haven't found them yet is because people who are higher up than her have disabled them. These higher up people she's referring to are the Illuminati. Zhao is a member of this group, so this is just one of their legitimate businesses that they can use to launder cash through, while also using its influence to control the market, as their plan is to eventually monopolize the entire augmentation industry, with Seraph being the only one left standing. To add another step in our chase, Zhao has been seen talking with Eliza Kassan, the biggest news anchor in the world, so Eliza is either working for them or at least knows what's going on. This is when Jensen will discover that Megan and her team are actually alive. At the time, pretty much everyone assumed that they were all dead, but not everyone was convinced. There's even a side quest from Megan's mom where you can look into the investigation of her death to find any inconsistencies. So in its defense, the reveal is quite the revelation and a fine part of the game, but it's this part that I was talking about. We go from finding a hacker to now finding Megan. I gotta be honest, the whole princess is in another castle trope is one of my least favorite ideas in any medium. The reason I hate the trope so much is because it's an easy way to extend a story under the guise that it's actually going somewhere. We are no closer to finding Megan now than we were 8 hours ago, and we still have another 8 to go before we finally meet her. It's not even possible to analyze the plot any deeper than we've already gone, because all you'll end up getting is Megan. That's the central plot of Human Revolution: find Megan. And while there were many fun side quests to do along the way, when you isolate the main plot, you start to see the issue. To continue on though, before I start acting like the game and delaying the plot all the way to the end, the finale of this section has us meeting with Eliza, only to find out that she is an AI, which is how she's able to keep up with her 24/7 news coverage. Upon learning about all this, we then return to Detroit, which is when the riots start to happen. People are firebombing buildings, causing havoc, and generally making a mess of the city, all because it was learned that Seraph Industries was creating super soldiers with their new augmentation technology. Hoping to tip the scales in his favor, Bill Taggart, a member of the Humanity Front, a pro-human organization, is holding a speech today regarding these events. We plan to attend this meeting, as talking with him will lead us to his aide Sandoval, who will lead us to Megan, as according to him, the GPL trackers are still online, but are being broadcasted at a frequency that is so low no one would be wise enough to look there. Thanks to this, Pritchard is able to track one of the scientists, except we discover that it's not the scientist, but rather a man named Tong who took the arm of the scientist and used it for himself. He refuses to give up the location of the team, or where he thinks the team is located, until we do him a solid, which is to rescue his son, who happens to be Tracer Tong from the classic games. Tom will then give us a location of a port where he wants to plant a bomb. This explosion will not only cripple Bell Tower, but will also distract the people here long enough for us to sneak into a cryopod onto a ship that's supposedly headed to Megan and her team. Do you see why I don't like this goose chase stuff? What have I said in the past 5 minutes that has been genuinely interesting and not a summarization of the plot? Thankfully, the gameplay is able to pull its weight, making these moments still enjoyable, but from a story perspective, we've reached a real low point in the quality of the writing, and it's about to hit the lowest point possible, as we're about to go on yet another 2-hour detour. While I usually save my talks about the DLC towards the end, the director's cut of Human Revolution integrated the DLC into the main story, so that it was more seamless than before, but it also caused the game to drag on even longer than it already is. Human Revolution's only DLC, The Missing Link, is such a bizarre piece of content, as it's trying so hard to be like Deus Ex's 5th mission where JC is captured, but it's doing it poorly. Jensen, like JC, is captured and has to scavenge gear in order to survive. Except unlike JC, Jensen also lost his augments too. The game will give you both your weapons and some upgrade kits, but it's not as many augments as you likely had, and your weapons don't come with any ammo, so they just take up 90% of your inventory and serve no purpose. My biggest problem was actually these augments, as the game was forcing me to buy back some of the augments I've already gotten when I could have just gotten new ones that I hadn't purchased yet. The fun of that escape mission was being able to use your augments while you were still searching for your gear. Removing the augments severely cuts down the amount of options the player has, because I highly doubt many players were going to rebuy the augments just to get them back later anyway. Now, to be fair, the game doesn't give you your augments back directly, only the kits you used to upgrade them, so I kinda screwed myself over by withholding them the whole time, thinking they were just going to come back online somehow. But I still think it is a bit much to remove all of them at the start of the DLC. To continue the theme of connection, not only do we have our own Daedalus who is helping us escape, but this research facility is a very important base to Bell Tower and subsequently the Illuminati. So in both cases, we're learning more about our enemies while we traverse through the levels. The main objective at the moment is to escape, only to find out that one of the members of Bell Tower was contacted by Interpol in order to help them take the group down from the inside. The methods of what goes on here though are its strongest story beat, as Bell Tower is apparently kidnapping people for the Hyron Project. This Hyron Project is basically a large supercomputer that is connected to a group of human beings, who are used as drones to help it operate. The two doctors here, Gary Savage, which was a nice cameo, and Tiffany Cavanaugh are being forced by Bell Tower to test the subjects they bring in, so that they can create suitable hosts for the supercomputer. As a side project, they're also being asked by DARPA to see if this kind of technology can be applied to the military, as they want to be able to track their soldiers down and check their combat awareness. So, basically, the plot of Metal Gear Solid 4. After confronting Dr. Cavanaugh, we can ask her to work with us to bring Bell Tower down, which she agrees to do. Stopping us from doing all this is, of all things, a loading screen, since the game decided to waste more of your time for whatever reason, as it has you go through these scans every time you enter a new area of the ship, and you'll often have to cross these multiple times as you have to report back to these people when the objective is complete. I know it's a bit of an odd thing to bring up, but it becomes very annoying to go through these after the 6th or 7th time, which is rather odd since the main game doesn't have any of this. The only loading screens that exist are when new areas are entered, not something like this, which is clearly disguised as a loading screen. Either way, the DLC, for as middle of the road as its story is, does have a really fascinating ending, as we're forced to choose between Dr. Cavanaugh or the captured prisoners on the ship. The reason I call it fascinating is if you instead refuse to make a choice, you could explore the prison area of the ship and find a vent that takes you to where the gas is being dispersed, letting you save both groups at the same time. It's a wonderful inclusion into the game, as like the original, it wants to avoid giving the player a set of binary options, but it also doesn't want to let the player choose the obviously correct choice, so it refuses to call attention to it. This will only be found by players who explore enough, and by those who refuse to accept that there are only two options. And it's good to see that the game is adding choices like this deep into the story. The very final scene of the DLC has us talking with our Daedalus, who is actually just the weapons merchant you meet earlier. All this conversation really does is set up a group of individuals called the Juggernaut Collective, who are enemies of the Illuminati. It's a nice addition, but they only show up in the sequel, so this won't amount to much until we actually get to that game. After this, Jensen will then go into another cryopod, but this time it takes him to Megan's lab in Singapore, and here is also her entire team that we'll have to rescue in order to proceed. Around here is where we meet with Zhao, but it's not a boss fight with her, as you still have to fight Namir. His fight is actually one I quite liked, as Zhao is able to disable your augmentations, leaving you permanently EMP'd if you did a very specific choice. Upon entering Hengsha for the second time, Jensen will experience a bit of a short circuit along with all the other augmented people in the vicinity. Something happened to the chips on a global level, so everyone is urged to visit a clinic to get the new chips. The timing of this seems rather convenient, and it is, because the Illuminati planned this so that the new chips would become the industry standard, which would also come equipped with technology that they can use to control people, allowing the Illuminati to literally control people on a worldwide scale. Pritchard advises Jensen to visit one, and if you do, then you're affected by the EMP, but if you choose not to, then you just continue the fight as normal and are allowed to use your augmentations again. Similar to the choice in the DLC, it's another example of this game's hands-off approach to its choices. This option is only mentioned once by Pritchard, and it's not even really an option, as the game never gives you a quest marker or any kind of objective to visit the clinic. He just says, hey, you should visit a clinic, and you can if you want to, but if you do, you'll get consequences hours down the line. After about 16 hours of playing, we finally come face to face with Megan, and it's here where the story starts to take a very deadly turn, as on screen is Hugh Darrow, the creator of augmentations, who is currently holding a speech at the base of his new project called Panchaea. What follows is horrifying to say the least, as he activates a button which turns all augmented people psychotic, causing them to kill anything in sight, and not just in the room, but around the world. In order to stop the biggest mass killing in history, our goal is to go to this Panchaea and stop the broadcast. Panchaea is the final level in the game, and just like the games before it, this is where we get to meet the leaders and choose our ending. The first one by default is Hugh Darrow, who despite being a madman, does have his reasons. See, he knew about the Illuminati and what they planned to do with the biochips, so he came to the obviously logical conclusion that the Illuminati can't control what doesn't exist, so killing augmented people would prevent them from being controlled. The issue is that is an incredibly flawed look at the situation. Hugh Darrow naively thinks that some good will come out of this, but we can convince him that, yeah, he might be the philanthropist Hugh Darrow today, but tomorrow he'll be known as the biggest mass murderer in history. His counter-argument, though, is that the people will be able to see through the corruption and understand that he needed to do this. But I highly doubt they'll be able to see that far with all the piles of dead bodies in the way. What's quite unexpected of him is that despite being the father of augmentations, he actually thinks humanity should evolve naturally without their use anymore. But this isn't due to some moral decision to let people be free or something. It's driven from a petty view of jealousy, because ironically enough, he's one of the few individuals in the world that can't use augmentations. He's the opposite to Jensen, wherein no matter how much neuropozyne he takes, his body always rejects it, which is a rather fitting fate for someone like him. For his ending, he wants to broadcast a message to the world that unveils the truth about the Illuminati and how the secret group everyone thinks is a dumb conspiracy is actually real. If we want to, though, we can instead edit the message and create a fake narrative that puts the blame on a different group. These two endings come from Seraph and Taggart, who unlike the previous games are endings you can miss, as once again the game only suggests that you can save them here in Panchaea, but never gives you the location or writes it in your quest log. Seraph suggests that you spin the story and put the blame on Taggart and his people at Humanity Front, claiming that they turned to biological warfare to kill augmented people. Taggart, on the other hand, wants you to say that a bad batch of neuropozyne was distributed and contaminated people for a time, which is what caused the disturbance. He also makes a note that while he is pro-human, he doesn't want to remove augmentations, only regulate them. Like Invisible War, though, we can also opt to refuse and instead destroy Panchaea, which would kill Seraph, Darrow, Taggart, and us, meaning that no one would be able to spin the story, letting humanity decide what happened for themselves. While all great, this is why I've been so vocal about the main plot, as we have spent 16 hours searching for a woman we lost 30 minutes in, only to choose an ending between 3 men we've barely interacted with all game. We have talked to Taggart and Tarot twice, and Seraph maybe 3 or 4 times at most, and all I have to show for it is that one wants to continue augmentation research, one wants to destroy it, and one wants to regulate it. Say what you will about Invisible War, but at least we got to see the factions for ourselves and learn about their beliefs and values. Human Revolution does none of that, as it instead thought it'd be better to focus on our goose chase. What makes things worse is the endings themselves. Not only are the endings literal buttons on a computer, quite possibly the laziest way I've ever seen it done, but more damning is that Eliza tells you what will happen if you choose a specific ending. According to her, if we choose Darrow's ending, the world will reject augmentations and the people will live freely. But why is this being shown before I make a decision? Isn't that what the end slides are supposed to be? The beauty of the Omar ending from Invisible War is that the consequences of the world falling to ruin came after your heroic triumph of defeating all the leaders at once. Had the game mentioned this fate before enacting the ending, it would have lost all its meaning. Human Revolution spoils its own endings before you're even allowed to choose, which doesn't make sense at all. Eidos Montreal also made the interesting choice of committing so hard to the Illuminati being a shadow organization by making them a complete shadow throughout the whole story. I told you we wouldn't see them until after the intro, which begs the question of why they was even there to begin with. The cherry on top of all of this is that the final boss that stops us is one of the worst fights I've ever done in my life. The final boss of the game is Zhao, because that makes sense. To stop her, all we have to do is pull down these levers which house these human drones we saw from the DLC. Which, now that I think about it, was probably an incredibly weird experience to have without the DLC, as these women are only shown in that extra piece of content. Maybe that's why it's called the missing link. After the women have been killed, all you have to do is sit on this ledge and wait as Zhao will electrocute the floor, but this wall will save you from it entirely. Then you just wait 3 minutes for her to break the glass, and then shoot her. Mechanically, it's a mess, and narratively, like the other bosses, has no real impact, as Zhao has done absolutely nothing since the start of the game. Yes, she is a member of the Illuminati, and the CEO of Serif's biggest competitor, but that's just her story. She isn't actually doing anything in the game itself. Walter, on the other hand, took control of UNATCO, sent troops to kill us, and turned on our kill switch, all in an effort to stop us. Zhao has done nothing of the sort, which is why I was actually baffled that she was the final boss. From top to bottom, these last 20 minutes are pretty bad, which ultimately leaves a rather sour aftertaste when playing. But just like I said before, Human Revolution is better than the sum of its parts. As if you look at it from a more broad perspective, looking at it as a game and not sections of content that make up a game, Human Revolution is without question a fantastic and well-made product. While I do have my gripes, the positives of its design are so strong that it easily overshadows anything that attempts to bring it down. It may have a disappointing ending, a goose chase of a plot, and some mediocre boss fights, but its theme of discrimination, its characters, world, and its gameplay are some of the best, if not the best, in the series to date. Jensen and company are extremely likable. Having the story shift towards a more central theme of mechanical racism was a surprising but welcome choice, and its decision to only focus on that one aspect of the writing allowed the team to divert all the willpower towards the one goal of creating a homogenous world under discrimination. And the gameplay, while not talked about much in this video, is simply fantastic. It feels fluid and is without those rough edges that the other games came with. It is truly the perfect example of what a modern reimagining of a classic Deus Ex game could look like, and by doing so, the team shot the series in a mainstream appeal, racking in more sales than ever before, with Human Revolution passing both Invisible War and the original Deus Ex's lifetime sales in just a few weeks. Deus Ex had finally hit the mainstream, and there was a sense that the team was just getting started. As while they left many things unanswered or unexplored, like Panchaea, the Illuminati, and many of its key characters, it seems that the team didn't miss the opportunity to talk about it, but rather decided to wait until the time was right. Mankind Divided has a reputation of being more of the same, and that is not something I disagree with. From its gameplay to its story, it's honestly just a prettier version of Human Revolution with the occasional new change here and there. And your feelings about Human Revolution will carefully illustrate your thoughts on Mankind Divided, either just more good or more bad. As someone who enjoyed the prior entry, this was right up my alley. Human Revolution is not the only game it's copying though, as it's also taking a few pages out of Invisible War, as instead of the collapse, we now have the AUG incident, often shortened to the incident. The difference is when these events occur in their respective games. Invisible War took place 20 years after the collapse, Mankind Divided is 2 years after the incident. 20 years is a long time, hell I've only been alive for 23, and that time was reflected in the environment. People were doing quite well for themselves, and locations, while occasionally run down and deserted, looked a lot better off than you would imagine. The world had moved past the collapse and evolved, like we humans usually do. We take it on the chin and move on, doing what we can to make the most of a situation no matter how bad it is. When Mankind Divided, the incident is still fresh. That attack that Hugh Darrow triggered in the last game is still being discussed, and people are still experiencing the ramifications of it. It's had time to sink in and fester, corrupting the minds of the people that were alive to witness it. Everyone is still mourning over the deaths that occurred as a result of the attack. People are fearing for their lives and are actively avoiding anyone with augmentations just in case it happens again. All while those that were affected are on the receiving end of this hatred, leaving them broken, wondering how something like this could happen, questioning why they would attack the people they love, and are also just as afraid of leaving their houses. 20 years was too long. 2 years is just right, as it throws you right into the heart of the conflict. And just like Human Revolution, the game does just as well, if not a better job, at conveying the horrors of living in a world as a mechanical human. Thanks to the incident, many laws have been put in place which were designed to segregate and eliminate augmented people. Random security checks are made by the police when they deem a specific person to be suspicious, which is pretty much all the time. Augmented people are also forced to go through various checkpoints just to cross into certain areas, and the subways have been segregated with quote-unquote naturals or regular humans getting their own subway car away from the augmented. Neuropazine dependency is also at an all-time high since Serif Industries actually went bankrupt following the attack, with Tai Young Medical buying up the company, giving them a monopoly over the market. Neuropazine is now a rare commodity, almost as valuable as gold to some people, which you, the player, can actually trade with, granting you useful items and info. So not only are augmented people being beat in the street, but the drug they need to survive is rare and extremely expensive. Some people are so shook by the side effects in the world around them that they feel like they have no choice but to give up. Like this one woman who asked if I could kill her but not make it super bloody as she still wants her family to identify her when she's dead. Or this family who is debating whether to have a child both for financial and social reasons, as the kid would have to grow up with augmented parents. But you know how it goes. Push someone long enough and it's only a matter of time until they push back. And that push in this case is domestic terrorism, as numerous bombings and shootings have occurred throughout the world, with the perpetrators mostly, if not all, being people with augments. This, while a temporary solution for some, has created a permanent solution for the rest of the world, as those who are augmented are now being punished for their acts. Similarly, discrimination and bigotry has increased even more since then, and is once again another unfortunate occurrence that our world shares with the game. As following any major incident or attack, anyone who just so happens to look like the people that are responsible for it are always going to be affected. Muslims are ridiculed and subject to hate crimes thanks to the attacks in 2001, and many Asians all over the world were verbally or even physically abused because of COVID since it originated in Wuhan, China. It's horrible, but the game does a wonderful job of showing these horrors to you by ironically shoving it in your face, as you can't go a few minutes without someone either calling you an aug or seeing someone be attacked simply for their augmentations. Just like the previous game, the side quests also have a heavy focus on this aspect of the world, but this time they amplified the intensity. Before it was quests involving augmented people and some of the discrimination they face, but it was always just a few bad apples. After the incident, it's now rare to find someone who is actually pro-aug, which leads to those who are augmented to stick together, creating a further disconnect between the two groups. One of the earliest examples is once again one of the best missions in the game, as upon leaving his apartment, Jensen is stopped by a cop who asks for his papers. He hands them to the cop only to discover that they are out of date, and that the new ones just came in that he needs to get. Jensen finds this absurd, but plays along, as the cop instructs him to go to a forger he knows since he sympathizes with augs. In actuality, he's just extorting you for money, since not only are the prices of the forgeries 35,000 credits, but he's not even a real cop. He just set up this checkpoint to make a quick buck on the less fortunate. It's a lot like those scam emails you likely get every day. No one with an ounce of computer knowledge would fall for this stuff, but all those scammers need are a few people that are either too careless or too desperate to notice. Not having your papers in this post-incident world of Deus Ex is a major offense, and will get you sent to Golem City, a place completely designed to house augmented people. It's like a civilized concentration camp. People can hold jobs and do normal everyday things, but they can't leave the city, are watched by police 24/7, and are as likely to be robbed by a fellow aug than they are to get shot in the street by police. It's a horrible place to live, and no one in the city seems to enjoy their time there, making these people's lives even more miserable than they already are. Within this side quest though, we can actually meet the woman making the forgeries, and we come to learn that she has good intentions, but the people working with her are the ones extorting people for money. So she offers us a chance to help a few people by getting them some fake passports. Talking with them really gives you a sense of how the world treats these people. Arenka, for instance, seems to have split personality disorder, referring to herself as Helena, which usually manifests from intense trauma. And given the world right now, it's not far off to assume that this personality of hers was created to stop her mind from breaking. Edward, on the other hand, is a store owner who is seen getting robbed by the time we arrive. He goes on to explain that when the incident happened, he was with his family and that the attack caused him to kill his grandchild. As a result, his family cut off contact with him, and now he has no one in his life. He stays here in Prague though because he wants to be close to his family even if they don't want him. We end up helping these two out by giving them passports, only to discover that we can only activate one. Choosing one causes the other to end up in Golem City. So by attempting to do some good, we end up making one person's life even worse than before. To further add to this, some people have opted to search elsewhere for answers. Most augmented people live in the sewers, and quite a few people can either be found at the Church of the Machine God or at this underground magic show. The church believes that all augmented people are in actuality blessed by the world, and will evolve into what's known as the Singularity, where they all merge into one consciousness and transcend death. There is a splinter group within the church though that we end up running into during a main quest, where they believe in something called the Ascension as opposed to the Singularity, which is roughly the same thing, except they also merge with the Machine God themselves and become one. The magic show, on the other hand, was designed by a former magician to help the augmented live carefree lives away from the harm and dangers of the real world. The only way he was able to achieve that though was by hypnotizing them into believing what he says. But while his methods were nefarious, his goal is commendable, as he was able to create a small piece of heaven here in the sewers, as all the members have all the necessities they need and never need to leave, but this obviously came at the cost of their free will. It's pretty easy to see this stuff as absurd, especially the religion bit since it was just made up recently after the incident, so there's likely not a whole lot of proof to their religious claims. But it shows that these people truly believe that they have no way out, so they try to find comfort in something. Anything, just so they don't throw themselves off the nearest roof. Outside of the here and now, there are also plenty of things happening in the background that add to the horror, chief among them being the Human Restoration Act, a bill that if passed will call for the removal and downgrade of all powerful and unlicensed augmentations. It would also force control chips to be put into anyone who is augmented, which would presumably let the owners of the chips track their movements and maybe even outright control them. And there was also a test going on for augmented people by Tai Young Medical, which has volunteers who are clearly not mentally stable have certain implants put into them hoping to cure them of that deficiency. Ideally, this would help those with depression overcome it, as they would have an implant of someone's DNA put into them that doesn't have depression. But this backfired when one of the patients was given the DNA of a serial killer, causing her to kill augmented people by ripping out their limbs and letting them bleed to death. It is hard to get a grasp on when this happened though, as the killer Daria was a patient before the incident, but Tai Young Medical also ran out of packages to use, so they offered prisoners to scan their DNA because that's a logical thing to do, but none of this seems to have happened as a result of the incident. Still, since her killings occurred during the events of the game, it continues to make things worse for augmented people, as now they have a serial killer on the loose that only targets them, and the police seem to not be losing any sleep over this, since most seem to chalk this up as an accident or just ignore the murder entirely since the victim was augmented. The world of Deus Ex has not been kind to augmented people, and it's only gotten worse. A staggering 89% of augmented people prior to the incident have been killed, leaving only 7 million people left in the world. And no matter where they go, they're always faced with some kind of ridicule and discrimination, and seeing as Jensen is augmented himself, he too is faced with the same level of scrutiny, not just from the police, but from common everyday people. Those police checkpoints force Jensen to hand over his papers every time you pass, and unlike the Missing Link DLC, this is not an excuse to hide a loading screen, as most of this occurs right before you leave the metro, which is where the actual loading screen occurs. This was 100% deliberately made to stop your playtime and to piss you off. And while it most definitely did, as it ruins the flow of exploration and gameplay constantly, it was designed to do exactly that. Some people on the street also attempt to antagonize him, but given he's still a brick shithouse with retractable blades in his arms, no one's really going to give him any issues. Within all the violence and death though are lights in the darkness, people that are willing to fight the good fight on behalf of the augmented. The two main groups are ARC and Samizdat. ARC, or the Augmented Rights Coalition, fight for the fair treatment of all augmented citizens. And Samizdat is a self-publishing magazine that seeks to spread the truth. They don't personally do this for augmented people, it just so happens that most of the fake news spread throughout the world is made to paint augmented people in a negative light, so they do help them on occasion. Both of these groups don't fight violently, however, as the battles are done diplomatically, as they both attempt to spread the truth and make sure people are treated fairly. Mainstream media is doing its best to shut them down though, like Picus TV, still run by Eliza Kassan, who has been fabricating and twisting more stories in order to drum up controversy, by claiming that those recent terrorist attacks were done by members of ARC in order to make them look bad. Like I said, it's a pretty evil world, and thanks to Jensen being the main character, the player gets to experience this stuff firsthand. It's not just that Jensen is being harassed or cursed at, it's the player too, and the dialogue system lets you express yourself further than ever before, by letting you internalize those emotions or unleash them. If a guy wrongs you, should you kill them because of how they treated you? What would the public think? Would I be no better than what they think I am? On the other hand though, if they already see me as the villain, then why should I try to be anything but that? It's a rather impressive way to structure a story and its dialogue, and just like Human Revolution, Mankind Divided does an incredible job of creating a world that is overrun with racism and hatred, while also letting the player be the target of those attacks, letting them experience firsthand the horrors of the world they're in, and then letting them come to a decision as to how they want the world to perceive them. You might have noticed though that all this talk has been about the incident, the thing that occurred in the last game, the thing which had no bearing on any of our endings, which begs the question, Mankind Divided is a sequel, what ending did it go with? Well, the answer might surprise you, in that Eidos Montreal chose none of them. Alright, saying none is technically lying. It's more like all of them are canon, but the game does its best to invalidate them anyway, making it feel like none. So firstly, the how. Well, according to the writers behind the game, thanks to all the media coverage and news surrounding the attack, Jensen was able to get the message he chose out to the world, but it was buried underneath everything else that came out at the time. Yes, somehow Eliza Kassan, one of the most recognizable people in the world who owns a 24/7 news station watched by billions, couldn't get the message out to the world as other information was circling the net. Sure. On top of this, Panchaea was so structurally weak anyway that the place was going to collapse regardless of if they pressed the button for that ending either. Like I said, all of them are canon, but the game goes to great lengths to make it feel like your choice was meaningless. Once again though, I am okay with the direction of the endings, as the only important part was the incident, the thing that occurred outside of the ending. And having the endings not have any weight means the script could focus on the topic at hand. Still sucks that this was the result though. As for Jensen, well, he managed to survive the collapse along with David Seraph, however he had to be taken to a clinic in Alaska so they could operate on him. Which brings us to today, 2029, 2 years after the previous game, where Jensen is now working for Interpol, whose job is to track down and take out international terrorists. He is of course the only AUG on the strike team and the whole task force it seems, which doesn't really help him much, but he is naturally the most capable of the bunch. The current mission is to find their contact who's been working undercover with the Jinn, who sell and manufacture black market goods. Once we arrive at the meeting site, everything goes well, until the deal is broken up by mysterious men in gold masks. These guys are called the Shadow Operatives, the Illuminati's henchmen. While a rather simplistic mission, not only is this a great tutorial as it gives Jensen access to most of his augments, allowing you to experiment with them now so you can buy them when they inevitably are reset, but it also shows how many fingers the Illuminati has in the world's pie. and by God do these guys have fingers. These assholes double dip their way into everything in this game, and are the sole reason for just about everything that goes on in the world, whether that's something that's already happened or things that are about to happen. Jensen is not without help though, as he has teamed up with a woman named Alex Vega, who's a member of the Juggernaut Collective, the same group that the Missing Link DLC alluded to earlier. They are mortal enemies of the Illuminati and will butt heads with them at just about every single interval throughout the story. Unfortunately, just like the previous game, their time in the script is incredibly short. The Juggernaut Collective only extends to the few talks with Vega and one meeting with Janus, the group's leader. And the Illuminati is once again given one and only one cutscene to characterize themselves with. It is admittedly a lot better than the first game, as we actually get to see some of the old guard return, or I guess, new guard, since narratively this is their first appearance. Either way, Bob Page is back once again, but now joined by Morgan Everett, Lucius De Beers, someone who I didn't mention but we can meet back in the first game, and some other members that we know of but haven't seen before, like Elizabeth DuClaire, Nicolette's mother. Their role in all this is to make sure the Human Restoration Act passes, likely due to the control chip part of the act, so they're orchestrating events to make sure that they go the way they want, whether that be a bombing by members of ARC or robbery that didn't actually happen. The Collective is trying to prevent them from doing this, and Jensen, while not officially working for them, will assist them from time to time. While in Prague, Jensen is here to meet with the task force so they can figure out what happened in Dubai, only for a bombing to occur at the train station, almost killing them both. While it is once again an incredible start, I garnered a much more negative opinion about this later, as we are once again going on a goose chase, but this one ends in such a bizarre way. The main objective as of now is to figure out who carried out this bombing, except we don't learn who it is. In fact, you won't learn who, because it's answered in the DLC that I'll eventually get to later. The game does at least refuse to drag it on for the entirety of the game, and decides to focus on a few more interesting paths in the narrative first, which involve working with Vega to determine if our boss Miller is working with the Illuminati, and skipping the bomber entirely by not finding who did it but rather who ordered the hit, which sees us going to Golem City and talking to the leader of ARC, Talos Rucker, as he is the most likely suspect. Both of these missions actually end up converging on each other due to the subject matter, as while investigating Miller, Jensen learns that his boss, who ends up being Manually from the first game, wants him to pin all the bombings and attacks on ARC, even a break-in in VersaLife that didn't even happen. According to him, all of the reports will say that the perpetrators were augmented, so the most likely suspect that the media and public will assume is ARC. This paints Miller as a bad guy, one who is working against what Interpol stands for, while also proving that ARC and their leader Talos Rucker are innocent. It ends up creating a disconnect between the player and the people they work for, as you feel alone throughout your whole journey, not just as an AUG in a world where AUGs are hated, but the fact that the one organization you work for you can't even trust. And I think the game hammers home this idea more by making your pilot incredibly dislikable. In every game so far, the protagonist could always rely on the pilot to side with them even when the going got tough. But now thanks to Malik being replaced with Chicane, Jensen can't even get that. You truly feel isolated within this world, and this was amplified tenfold when we were sent to Golem City. I have expected both Miller and Chicane to betray me, forcing me to escape the city on my own. Fortunately, they didn't, but I couldn't help shake the feeling that they could have easily trapped Jensen in this city, and I highly doubt that he would have made it out on his own. A lot of this is due to the oppressive nature of Golem City, as space is limited and buildings are stacked taller than the eye can see. It also helps that they had some pretty easy source material to work with, as much of the design from Golem City comes from the real-life Kowloon Walled City, a fascinating piece of architecture that was designed to fit tens of thousands of people in one densely packed area. It's also infamous for having some of the highest crime ratings of all time. Since there were no governing bodies in the city, most people who lived there dabbled in illegal businesses, like selling black market goods or prostitution, and most of the ruling class were thugs and gang members eager to make a quick buck. Golem City is much the same way, as most of the city's people are suffering and are often extorted for the little money they have, but the cops don't care. It's quite possibly the best location in the game though, due to its detail and design, and this speaks to a lot of the game's level design, as not only are most locations larger than the ones seen in Human Revolution, but the sheer level of detail in them is unmatched. There's a lot more areas and routes for the player to explore and traverse through, which adds to the gameplay loop. And Golem City is the best place to showcase this, as it takes full advantage of the new technology to add more levels to the environment, meaning areas are taller rather than larger. Golem City also provides the player with a unique touch of agency towards the latter half of the level, as replacing these sturdy and more organized cops are the more chaotic augmented members of ARC. This gets the player to think about how they want to approach the situation. Should they kill these guys? Not only do we not know if they're guilty, they're augmented. They're like Jensen, and killing them means we're no better than the cops that butcher them in the streets. It's an incredibly small change, but really changes the flow of the gameplay. At most, the following conversation with Talos Rucker is a bit harder to succeed in, which isn't much of a consequence, but I am glad that it was still brought up. The game doesn't penalize you for this that much, and you won't be locked out of content for killing these people, but I still felt like I needed to spare them. Just like the endings of the original Deus Ex, only a good game can get you to do something like this, to actually feel like every little thing you do has consequences, or that your choices will have actual meanings to them. And Mankind Divided hooked me in well enough that I felt like I needed to handle it this way. Reaching the top of the ivory rusted tower sees us meeting with Talos Rucker. And as you would expect, he's actually quite the nice guy. In fact, we can ask people about him in Golem City and pretty much all of them echo the same thing, that he's a wonderful leader and just doing what he can for augmented people. Even his emails show this too, as he's being thanked for helping someone get neuropathy while also assisting the women, as they're often targets of abuse here in the city. He's a real stand-up guy, but the media paints him as a villain, and it's only going to get worse, as shortly after our conversation, he's killed by some kind of virus that infects his systems. It's later learned that it was from a drug called Orchid, which will supposedly eliminate the need for neuropazine, but it's being made by VersaLife, which is the first sign that its properties aren't real, and also the fact that the Illuminati are controlling the media to make it seem like the Orchid is a life-saving drug, when it's really designed to be a bioweapon that controls the population. So as expected, the Illuminati have once again thwarted our plans, as they've planted a man named Marchenko into ARC who secretly works for the Illuminati so they can kill Talos Rucker when the time is right. Before his passing, he gives us a datapad with info on it that he was looking into regarding a mole in his organization. Reading through it points to JM, or Joseph Manderley, being the one who ordered Talos Rucker to be killed. Just like the first game though, Manderley is under the thumb of the Illuminati, further confirming their involvement. Following this, Jensen is sent back to Prague to follow up on a few more leads, which ends up leading into a main quest decision that I was not expecting. During your time here, you'll meet with a man named Nomad Stanek, whose daughter Allison seems to fit the bill of the train station bomber. While this is happening though, Vega got a tip about VersaLife's vault at the Palisade Bank. The problem is that VersaLife is currently double timing it to the bank so they can wipe all the info, and Allison is currently getting ready for the church's ascension, so if we do this last, she'll be dead by the time we arrive. So we're forced to choose which one to do, and this is one decision where we can't get what we want. We have to pick one or the other. Once we find her, we realize that Allison was not the bomber, but someone who made the bombs used during the attack, and that she is also a part of the splinter group within the church I mentioned earlier. The conversation is kinda painful to sit through. It's almost like talking someone off a ledge, as she's going to either die by our hands or by the machines if we don't help her. She, like many, was affected by the attack and became increasingly depressed over what she experienced and the subsequent discharge from the military that would follow. It's clear that she is a woman in need of guidance. While I'm not against doing it spiritually, killing yourself in the name of that god doesn't really sound like the right idea to me. If you instead go to the bank, you'll find a sample of the Orchid virus in a video call between Megan Reed and Bob Page. Megan seems to always find her way into controversy, as she is the lead researcher behind Orchid, but like before, she has no knowledge of its harmful effects. What's fascinating about Orchid though is that the research used for the virus is similar to the one she was using in the first game, meaning this virus is once again based off Jensen's DNA. In fact, he'll be infected by it later only to not feel anything, further alluding to its origin. Additionally, while not stated outright, the properties of the virus, and the owners of it, that being the Illuminati, could also mean that this was the virus that would later become the Grey Death. Somehow though, that's not even the weirdest item in this vault, as by going into this corner and throwing an EMP grenade you can get a brief glimpse of what's inside the box, only to discover that it's Jensen, or at least something that looks like him. This has created an ongoing theory that the Jensen we play as in Mankind Divided is a clone. Now I don't claim to be the owner of the theory nor the method on how to find it. That said, what has been difficult to pin down when it was first discovered, all the info regarding the theory has been compiled on the game's wiki fandom page by the user Eratis. I'll link to it down below if you want a more in-depth look, as we're only going to be hitting the broad strokes here. But the general idea is that this Jensen is a clone. The evidence to support it comes from a variety of sources throughout the series. Firstly, cloning isn't exactly unheard of, as seen by the Dentons in the classic games, which were overseen by the Illuminati, who owns VersaLife. As for the rest, at one point in the game you get a call from David Seraph who's looking to catch up, and when you talk to him, Jensen can mention his new augmentations. Early on in the game, Jensen goes to a clinic to get his augs fixed up after that train station bombing, but his mechanic Kohler found his new augmentations that not even Jensen knew about. Gameplay-wise, this is just an excuse to add new augmentations to the gameplay loop, which are the glitch ones that appear on screen. Neither Jensen nor Seraph knew about them though. According to Jensen, after Pangaea, he was taken to a clinic in Alaska so they could repair his body, but Jensen doesn't remember much about his time there, as it's mostly a blur. After looking into it more, Seraph realized that he couldn't find him on any of the survivor lists. He even tried looking at the serial numbers, since his original augmentations were made by Seraph, but he couldn't find those either. What this implies is that the Illuminati made an exact copy of Jensen with the same augments and everything, and that this being in the pod is either the real Jensen or another clone. Now we could go on for hours arguing about this, like why is there a being in the box in the first place if it was completely pitch black? Or maybe that this was a placeholder that they decided to throw in here with no real thought behind it. Well, it's clear that the rabbit hole on this theory goes deep, taking into account cut content, hidden dialogue, and a few of the novels. In an ironic twist, a series about conspiracies, finally gave the community their own conspiracy to latch onto. Questioning the existence of the Illuminati, or if the Grey Death was made by the government, has now turned into a discussion about whether or not the main character is even real. Similarly, the community is just as vocal about it from either side, some saying Jensen is a clone while others pass it off as nothing more than a hoax. It's incredible how a series like this, where NPCs spout all kinds of insane nonsense at you, making you question if what they say has any truth to it, managed to do the same exact thing with its own community. Although I guess that's what happens when you go without a sequel for 7 years. Minor tangent aside, the main reason I like this section so much is not the fact that we are possibly playing as a Solid Snake version of Adam Jensen while their big boss sits in the tank. It's actually because each mission provides the player with an item that can help them in a future mission. Confronting Allison and getting a high enough persuasion bonus will give us a signal jammer, something that is completely useless and takes up space in your inventory only for it to become useful right at the end. Likewise, inside the vault is a safe which contains a sample of a cure for Orchid. This will also be helpful as it can either give you more time in the final mission or save a life that will soon be taken. Not only is it wonderful to see the game rewarding the player with these kinds of items, but they are completely optional. Failing the speech check and missing the safe means you don't even receive the item that the game wanted to give you. It's a fantastic way of rewarding the player, but also making them work for it. The feeling of finding something this unique would lose its value if you were given it simply by doing the quest. But as immersive sims go, the game wants to reward those that explore. And Mankind Divided does that quite often, especially with this mission. Regardless of the option you pick though, each one has Jensen learn about a facility called Garm, which is where he plans to head to next. But before we go, just like Human Revolution, one of the game's DLCs takes place around this time, except it's not integrated into the main story, but instead through a new menu called Jensen Stories, so I figured it'd be best to run through it now. It's a real damn shame that this wasn't introduced into the main story though, because slotting it here would have made my opinion of it a lot better. Called Desperate Measures, it sees Jensen investigating who blew up the train station, because yeah, we're still focused on that apparently. But the issue is that it plays out like any other mission in the game, a quick 30 to 40 minute experience, except this is a separate piece of content so we don't have all of our equipment. That's why I dislike this so much. It doesn't speak extra content to me, and I think it's because it was never meant to be. Desperate Measures is the only DLC of the 3 that's not only free but was available day 1. If you watch my video on Mass Effect 3, then you might know where this is going, as we have yet another Javik situation on our hands. For those who don't know, Mass Effect 3, an RPG made by BioWare, had day 1 DLC in the form of a new companion called Javik. It was immediately met with criticism due to its price and that it was DLC that was available the day the game was live, which begs the question of why they didn't just add it to the game. Well, it was learned that due to the ESRB rating that goes on during development, the team realized that they wouldn't be able to get the game out on time for the rating and subsequent release, so while the game was being rated, leaving them with little to do, they decided to restructure his entire introductory mission so that it would flow well with how the game was going to end up. He was always envisioned to be a part of the full game, but due to time constraints, the team had to make some cuts. This is likely what happened here, as it's such an odd piece of content to add as something extra, as its plot not only follows a lead in the main quest, but it really is just a quest. It's no different than if they just took out any of the missions we've already talked about and then made that a separate download. The only important bit of information though is that we do learn that this guy's brother-in-law is the bomber, and that's about it. As a separate piece of content, it's obviously pretty bad, but imagining how the game would flow with this as a part of the main quest does make me feel a bit better about it. While we're here though, we might as well talk about the 2 other DLCs since we're approaching the end of this game very soon, and trust me, these next 2 are much better. The first of the 2 is System Rift, which is supposed to serve as a prologue to Breach, another game mode we could play alongside Mankind Divided. System Rift's main character outside of Jensen is Pritchard, which was a nice surprise. He needs to break into the Palisade Bank, the same one we just broke into earlier, but this time go deeper so we could find information on a company called the Santal Group. Now for being open and honest, most of this scene here is not too important, as the ending is what really matters, as it ends with Jensen accidentally opening a rift into the neural subnet, causing hackers all over the world to go inside and search for all the dirty hidden files that the place keeps hidden, and we play as one of those hackers in the Breach game mode. Still, I did enjoy the gameplay though, and the few characters we meet like Shadow Child were nice enough to listen to. I could see why Pritchard likes her though, as she has equally good taste in games, as the side objective from her is to place this statue on someone's desk, which is a model of Garrett from Thief. Which, on that note, I wonder how much of Thief inspired this DLC, as it feels like a proper Thief level but in a Deus Ex context. Much of Thief is spent going through massive castles and manors, coming through each floor, hallway, and room from top to bottom to find all the treasure. And while System Rift doesn't have you do that much in this area, going through the 6 or 7 levels of this bank with very little equipment to cling to as a backup reminded me quite a bit of Thief's level design. Much of my time was spent walking around people rather than taking them out one by one, as I just didn't have the resources to commit to that playstyle. The DLC is also long enough that it doesn't feel like a total waste to not have your augmentations, roughly doubling the length of the previous one. Overall, System Rift is quite solid. It adds a very complex level for the player to explore, and new types of enemies like ones that can see through your cloak augment. It's a nice piece of DLC, but I can't say that it's the best though. Many would tell you A Criminal Past is the best DLC in the game, and they are not wrong. It's so good that it's worth getting the season pass just for this. It first places Jensen in a maximum security prison while he recounts his time there to the task force's therapist. He was sent here undercover to find another one of their agents because there was a tip that a terrorist attack was soon to come, and this agent was the only one with the details on whether or not that was true. So Jensen has to act as a prisoner to find his way to his contact, but as soon as he enters, he's given a suppression drug that removes his augment capabilities. So no augs, no equipment, and locked in a prison. Talk about a start. But the good ideas keep flowing, as the DLC has a surprising amount of choices for such a short experience. One of the first people you'll meet is this doctor, who will give you a pill that supposedly removes the suppression effect the guards placed on you. If you refuse, then you can't regain your augments, but don't worry, you have another chance to take the pill later. Alternatively, you could use this altered biocell that will have the same effect, except you'll lose health every time you use it due to you not taking the pill. However, you can give this biocell to a prisoner named Flossie, who points you in the direction of another inmate named Red Shoes. Giving him the biocell makes the rest of the game easier, as eventually the prisoners will stage a riot, and if you gave up the biocell, the prisoners are able to overtake most of the guards. For a 2-hour DLC, there is an insane amount of choices here, and those are just the bigger ones, as there's even smaller, less significant choices. Like this one inmate who can trade you a multi-tool for some booze, and for the player, someone who has no equipment, a multi-tool sounds like ambrosia. Or even this maintenance locker which has a different block's jumpsuit in it, letting you walk through that block with ease, as without it the guards would shoot you on sight. Outside of the gameplay, there is also a fairly interesting narrative going on here. The head warden of the prison, Stenger, is working with a group called the Junkyard, who harvest augmented bodies for spare parts and then sell them on the black market. Well, Stenger realizes that a few dead prisoners wouldn't be seen as a problem to anyone outside of the prisoners themselves, so he sometimes provokes them into doing violent things, only to kill them after, followed by dumping their bodies off to the Junkyard so they can profit off the scrapped augments. The final part of this DLC has you trek into a war-torn prison covered in bodies from all sides, while Jensen attempts to escape with the other agent, and just like the previous DLC, I found that not attacking at all was better than taking out the guards from stealth, as there are numerous high-level enemies, such as ones with helmets or the ones with full-on power armor, that any kind of weaponry you could have found would still not be nearly enough to take them all down. By that metric, it's a pretty hard DLC, probably the hardest level in this game really. But dying is not only expected, but it has its own bit of flair to it as well, as the game takes a page out of Prince of Persia's Sands of Time. Like the DLC, Sands of Time's narrative is being told by the prince to someone else, so the prince can't die in the story or otherwise he wouldn't be here to tell it. So whenever you do die in the game, it plays off deaths and failures as the prince misremembering the story. Similarly, whenever you fail, the therapist can be heard correcting Jensen, saying things like, "Jensen, that's not what happened. Try again from the beginning." So Jensen restarting from the beginning is like the player restarting the checkpoint. It's a small but very neat touch to add to the game, which just shows how much love was put into this. A Criminal Past is without question an amazing DLC, and while it doesn't tie into the main story in any way, it's a wonderful bite-sized adventure to take part in. And if you play the DLCs after the main game is over, this will be the final piece of content you experience from the game and the series, and I can't think of a better way to end it than this. The reason I say that is because from here on out, things are going to start getting rocky, and Garm is really the calm before the storm. That's because the Garm facility is so much shorter than I thought it was going to be. It starts with Jensen being ambushed by Marchenko, who then injects him with the orchid, but given the orchid was made from his DNA, he's unaffected by it. So they just dumped him outside and also left all of his gear on him too. Bit of a strange start, but the rest of the mission is spent trying to escape the facility. And I do admit, this was quite fun, as the guards that stalk the halls are the Shadow operatives from the first mission. They are deadlier and more advanced than any other group in the game thus far, and they can be quite difficult to slip around even with the cloak augment. The problem comes right after, when Jensen calls Chicane to pick him up, and the two leave. So we went to a facility, got ambushed, and said, well shit, there goes our plan, and then left. What a waste of a quest. There was so much more to explore here, but they just used it as a quick 20-minute escape sequence. To be fair to the game, Marchenko and company being here is worth investigating, which is what we're going to be doing directly after this, but I vividly remember getting to the end and just thinking, wow, I can't believe it was over this quickly. It's just such an odd mission from start to finish. Upon returning from his vacation, Jensen realizes that Prague is now under martial law. Just like the first game, police will be patrolling the streets, shooting anyone who disobeys, including us. This poses a bit of a problem for the player if they want to finish up the game's side quests, as you'll have to be traveling around the city just to complete them. It's here in Prague though where we investigate a few more leads, one of which leads us to the Diwali headquarters, a sort of organized crime family. From them we get to learn that they're trying to target the Safe Harbor Convention in London, which is where the game's finale begins. The reason this event is so important is because the lead speaker, Nathaniel Brown, has been campaigning to veto the Human Restoration Act. But the Illuminati wants it to pass, so they plan on attacking the convention and spinning the story so that it passes. This level includes quite a fun minigame within it, which is to neutralize all the Illuminati members posing as guards, but getting caught skips right to the final mission. Now to be fair, killing all of them will go to the final mission anyway, but I like that the game added this as an option, this feeling that you screwed up and now have more problems on your hands. Plus, attacking a guard in plain sight will alert the partygoers, so you have to take them all out without anyone seeing you. I honestly had to get quite crafty with this one, such as tasing this civilian because he wouldn't leave the bathroom, or specifically taking out this guy behind the couch so that it could hide the body. No matter what happens though, you'll then be met with a choice, which will lead to an ending, and for the first time in a long time, we don't have to press a button to get that ending. The Illuminati have planned 2 attacks. They're going to poison the wine that Brown and his delegates are drinking, which will kill them if we don't get to them first, all while Marchenko is being ordered to blow up the nearby residential towers, potentially killing thousands in the process. Your ending, however, isn't based on this decision, but rather how fast you are completing them. Saving the delegates and stopping the bombs gets you 1 ending, failing both gets you another, and achieving a mixed outcome results in 2 more, for a grand total of 4 possible outcomes. And while the game doesn't mention this, you are on a timer, as you have roughly 10 minutes to complete them or you'll fail. Unfortunately, this means we can't discuss the endings as in-depth as we did before, since there really isn't much to go over. You either save them, or you don't. Still, the actual mission itself isn't that bad, as it finally lets you use those items you picked up earlier, as the orchid can be used to save Miller or the delegates if you were too late, and the signal jammer can be used to destroy the bombs before they explode. You can also find Marchenko's kill phrase on Red Desk and use it on him, which, like the original game, skips the fight entirely. Plus, it also reveals a shocking revelation to the player, and that's that Miller was never the bad guy all along. This whole time I thought he had some kind of plan to get rid of us, and I feel like most players experience that too, only for the game to reveal that Miller was just a regular guy who wanted to do good. And that made me equally sad and annoyed that I thought of him as my enemy when he was really just trying to do his best to do some good in the world. Even though he did follow the order that came down from Manderley, you could tell he didn't want to, and that he was only doing it to placate the higher-ups. Chicane is still a dickhead and still hates augmented people, but Miller was someone I wrongfully assumed was against me, and it sucks to see him die like this. That said, the endings of Mankind Divided are widely regarded as some of the worst in the series, and it's also something I agree with. A lot of why, however, has nothing to do with the actual game and more so the company behind it. Firstly, regarding the endings, while stopping both attacks is the best outcome, as long as you save Brown, you still end up with a good ending, as while thousands may have died, he was able to stop the bill from passing. Having him die in either outcome means it passes without opposition, and failing to stop the bombs along with that is just the icing on the mechanical cake. The following scene is then split into 2 segments, the first one being about the actual ending itself, echoing much of what I just said, with the second half being related to the other choices we made. For example, if you chose the heist, then a news report about a break-in would show on screen, but if you talked with Allison, then news of her arrest will be there instead. Likewise, doing certain side quests like teaming up with Samizdat will also appear there too. This one specifically was rather interesting, as the reports talk about a new group who appeared after Samizdat left Prague called Silhouette, the same one from the first game, led by Chad Dumier, who would eventually team up with Nicolette DuClaire to restart the Illuminati. It's admittedly a nice tie into the previous games, but the problem is exactly what I've shown you. Nothing was answered in these endings, and like the Garm facility, it feels like we were just getting started. Mankind Divided, like its predecessor, once again gives the Illuminati and now the Juggernaut Collective little screen time to feel present in the story at all, and the game itself feels like it was cut short, like the attack on Brown was supposed to be the climax, but in this case it was the resolution. It feels like the series wasn't done yet and that it had more to say. The after-credit cutscene even alluded to this, as we learn that the Illuminati know who Jensen is, and that they are not only anticipating his eventual meeting with the Juggernaut Collective leader Janus, but that the therapist working for the task force has been a part of the Illuminati this whole time. If you view it as the second game in a trilogy, a hypothetical Adam Jensen trilogy, then it feels a lot better. The story is going somewhere. Certain story threads have opened up, such as the Juggernaut Collective, and the eventual conflict between Jensen and the Illuminati is all but inevitable. But if you instead view it as a singular game, especially one that is the end of a series, then all of the impact is gone. It's no longer story beats that will be answered, but threads left unspun. Questions that only leave the player with interpretations, and some even less so. Now that's not to say that just because it wasn't going to be the finale that it's exempt from criticism, because even without that, the game's endings don't resolve anything. In fact, most of this game doesn't resolve anything. We are no closer to stopping the Illuminati, and we haven't moved anywhere in the plot at all. Jensen once again tries to stop the Illuminati only to either fail or hold them back at bay a little longer. And honestly, I would have been fine with that too, because numerous trilogies have done the exact same thing. Both God of War and Mass Effect were designed just like this. The first games were made to set the tone and introduce major characters at play, and while there was more to come, the games felt complete enough to be their own finales. The second games, on the other hand, ramped up the intensity and ended with a clear goal in mind. letting the player know that the second game was only there to set up the final conclusion. Kratos versus the gods of Olympus, Commander Shepard versus the Reapers, and what could have been Jensen versus the Illuminati. Mankind Divided really did divide the community with these endings. And that well and truly sucks, because Eidos-Montreal seemed keen on expanding this series, not just with other games, but other media too. Following the release of Human Revolution, numerous pieces of content were made for the series, including 2 novels, 2 novellas, 3 comics, Mankind Divided and its 3 DLCs, and 3 spin-off titles. Deus Ex The Fall, a Deus Ex game but on mobile, Deus Ex Go, a mobile puzzle game, and Deus Ex Breach, a free standalone version of the game mode that exists in Mankind Divided. They even attempted to go outside the realms of entertainment, as Deus Ex teamed up with Open Bionic, a prosthetic limb company, to make a skin that looks like Adam Jensen's arm. So it's clear that Eidos-Montreal wanted to take the series to new heights, but Square Enix shut them down. While its initial release was successful, its following weeks dipped below Human Revolution, and it seems like these low sales are what contributed to the end of the series. Even though according to their 2016 fiscal report, both Mankind Divided and Final Fantasy XV were explicitly mentioned to have helped them earn a positive return on their investments. As a result, Square Enix had Eidos-Montreal work on what they considered to be more profitable projects, like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Marvel's Avengers, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Yes, Deus Ex died because Square Enix had them create Marvel Avengers, the game that flopped on release and can't even be bought anymore as the servers were shut down and the game was pulled from digital storefronts in September of this year. To be fair to Square Enix though, a Marvel game is profitable, there is no doubt about that, but the way they handled it wasn't the right way. At the very least, the spin-offs we did get were okay. Deus Ex The Fall was an attempt by Eidos-Montreal to bring back the Deus Ex formula from Human Revolution to mobile, and they did succeed in doing so. For being a mobile title, there is a lot of detail in the environments, and most of the characters look pretty solid too. Some of the gameplay systems are a little puzzling though, like the fact that there is a universal vendor in your inventory allowing you to buy anything whenever you want, which while convenient, it does take away from the gameplay, as I find the fun of an immersive sim to be about using the tools you have or lack thereof. Many times I would find myself hoarding cash just to wait for the right moment to spend them, like buying an EMP grenade when a robot appears, or buying health stims and painkillers when I'm low on health. It's not a very interesting system, but by far its worst sin is that it's simply not finished. Not in the sense that it's buggy, but that it's just literally not complete. The Fall has 4 missions according to the wiki, but they are very generous about what counts as a mission, as the first has you going through a tutorial disguised as a stealth mission to understand the basics, before talking with some of the crew on a plane and then having a conversation with a woman named Anna in your apartment. That is 3 out of the 4 missions the game has. Panama City, the first location to provide an open explorable level with a few side quests sprinkled in, is also the last. To put it another way, it'd be as if Jensen went to Prague, but right before he goes to Gollum City, the game ends. That's how jarring it was to play The Fall, because there was clearly more than what we got, as the final shot of the game even has the "to be continued" plastered all over the screen. The Fall is basically a full-priced, full-release demo for a game that hasn't come out yet, which is a shame because the plot was at least going somewhere. Ben Saxton is the protagonist this time around, who is also the main character in a novel. In fact, this game is a sequel to that novel, so yeah, have fun keeping track of this story. But it first follows him being recruited to the Tyrants, that spec op group we killed back in Human Revolution, and all the members are here too, Namir, Yelena, and Barrett. This mission is a flashback though, as Ben eventually betrays the group, once he finds out that Namir was the one who got his men killed back when he was in the military during an Operation Rainbird. The rest of the game is spent with this girl Anna, who is also a part of the same novel as Ben, who are on the run from the Tyrants. The Fall also introduces Alex Vega from Mankind Divided, making this game her debut appearance. But there was clearly some work on her model in between releases, as she looks much different here in The Fall. The final mission has Ben escaping Panama with Vega before a man named Sam appears, who is one of the men Ben saw die during Operation Rainbird. So the game is setting up a conflict between Ben and the Tyrants, while also introducing Vega, which probably would have explained how she went from pilot to Juggernaut Collective member, before revealing the plot twist that one of Ben's men is not only alive, but also joined the Tyrants as well to hunt him. All things considered, it's got a solid foundation, but that's where the game ends. There was never an Australia level like the game promised. The Fall ends right here. It seems like they were going to drip feed these episodes over the coming weeks and months like Telltale does with their games, but due to the poor reception, the whole project was canned, which makes The Fall's reputation even worse, as it's not even a finished game. Breach, on the other hand, is actually quite fun, but I was also predisposed to like it because of its gameplay loop. As mentioned before, Breach is based around the breach Jensen made in that System Rift DLC, and now we play as one of the hackers, or rippers in this case, who are going into the neural net and looking for info that bigger companies want to keep hidden. To do that, we are to hop into a level and extract data from these columns before exiting the level. Each one has a certain criteria, like collecting fragments or killing a certain number of guards, and the game does its best to try to lay on the difficulty, by introducing more complex levels, harder enemies, and even modifiers, like taking more damage or having your health drain constantly throughout the level. The story for this game, though, is incredibly light, as that brief summary at the beginning of this section is the story. The whole point of this game is to complete these levels, and then that's it. The fun comes from repeating the levels to get higher scores and finishing additional challenges. Each level has an all data, score, and timer added to it, so it's assumed that you'll try to fully complete a level rather than just doing the bare minimum. Sometimes you won't be able to complete them just yet, so you're encouraged to come back when you have better equipment. Like in this example where I have to kill this giant brute type enemy. At the time I only had a pistol, so I need to get a bit crafty and throw these explosive cubes at it to win. Later, if I ever get a rocket launcher or some high-powered sniper, I could probably forget that strategy and just take the fight to it right away. I say later though, as I still haven't found those weapons, due to the game's RNG system. Either by activating reward nodes on the network map or by buying them in the in-game shop, you could acquire booster packs or loot boxes that contain all kinds of different items, from currencies to weapons to praxis kits. There is no end goal here in Breach, it's just fully completing every challenge and every level, and even then you can continue far past that too, as each one has a global leaderboard for score and speed, letting you compete with other players. As you would expect though, most of the top scores are hacked, which is ironic given this is a game about hackers competing to be the best hacker, so I guess that fits, but most of the top scores are legit. As odd as it is to say though, coming from someone like me, the story is actually the weakest part of the game, and I kinda wish it didn't even exist in the first place. At certain points, the game attempts to interject some kind of narrative into what you're doing by having you uncover secret info that clients want, which in gameplay terms is just doing the missions we're already doing, but this time with motivation. These are fine, but these text conversations you have in between the levels completely slow down the pace of the game. I can commend the team for trying to give at least some minor reason for playing, but personally, I just enjoyed the gameplay. I didn't need an explanation, just throw me back in and I'll run the gauntlet again. I'll be honest, I had a fun time playing Breach because I'm obsessed with these speedrun style games. I loved Mirror's Edge back when it was released 15 years ago, and I've been recently replaying the Ghost Runner games because it too wants you to continue far past the credits so you can improve your time. Breach is like that, but on a more bite-sized scale. Instead of spending 15 plus minutes going to a level, most require only a few seconds. Many of the top times are less than 5, and even the times on these levels are as low as 7 or 12 seconds. It's a fast-paced game about getting levels done as fast as possible, so the game only stops once you do, once you've determined that this is the fastest you could possibly go. Breach doesn't have a deep amount of complexity in its narrative like the rest of the series, or the immersive qualities of its gameplay, but it's not meant to. Breach is a separate standalone spin-off that was trying to be different, and honestly, I really enjoyed it. The reason I covered these games now as opposed to earlier in the video is because I played these games last, just like they were presented in this video. And while I did have fun, it felt like I was doing just whatever I could to play Deus Ex. I didn't want to stop playing this series, and just like the magic show, I was able to live in blissful ignorance for a little while longer with these spin-offs. But at some point I had to come back to reality and realize that the series was already done, and that there hasn't been another Deus Ex in over 7 years. But don't let this distract you from what we've already spent a couple hours talking about. If there is one thing I've learned being alive this long, it's that you should cherish the things you have and be thankful you even had them in the first place. Deus Ex's future may be in eternal limbo, and we may never get that ending that the players and the devs wanted, but despite this, we got a solid amount of fantastic games along the way. The original Deus Ex is still one of the most important and greatest games of all time, and in its wake, it jump-started one of the most iconic genres in gaming. Invisible War, while a step down, was at least ambitious. Oftentimes too ambitious, but it was a valiant attempt to market the game to a new audience. Human Revolution is still my favorite of the bunch, but even without my personal biases, as the name suggests, the game was revolutionary, bringing that classic Deus Ex feel to a more modern audience and actually succeeding in doing so. And Mankind Divided has easily some of the best gameplay and level design in the whole series, by taking what made the previous game great and evolving it into something better. The series isn't perfect, but it's damn good, and one that I would recommend anyone pick up, as there isn't too many games out there that let you experiment the way Deus Ex does, and even the ones that do don't always reach the peaks this series achieves. All you need to do first is jump down that rabbit hole and experience it for yourself. I did, and you should too. Thanks for watching. Thank you all for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed. It's nice to finally be making another series video like this. I went a bit longer than I wanted to without that kind of video, mainly due to last quarter's new releases, but I finally found some time to make another entry. If you ever want any updates on what video is next or how close the video is to being done, then feel free to turn on notifications, as I keep all of you updated on the community tab constantly. As always, like the video if you enjoy, and subscribe if you're new. Thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video, and take care everyone. Goodbye.